The unwanted child, a found girl, a hidden conspiracy, a rancher's last chance at redemption. In the scorching heat of Montana summer, when most men sought shade, former bounty hunter James Callahan discovered a dying child in a sealed freight car, and with her, a note that read, "No one's child." But some men don't walk away from abandoned things. Some men recognize themselves in the eyes of the unwanted. When a smooth-talking county official threatens to take the girl away, James uncovers a conspiracy that reaches back 16 years, to the brother of an outlaw he killed, to the death of his own wife, and to a network of corruption that's been stealing land from the defenseless across 3 territories. Now the hunter has become the hunted, and the child he saved may be the bait in a trap set by a ghost from his past. If this story reaches you, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. I want to see how far Grace's journey travels. And if her fight for belonging moves you, hit that like button and settle in, because this is a story about what happens when love becomes worth fighting for. The heat hit like a fist the moment James Callahan stepped off his horse at the depot. Montana summer, 1889. The kind of scorching afternoon that made men mean and animals stupid. The air shimmered above the railroad tracks, distorting the mountains in the distance until they looked like they were melting into the sky. Cicadas screamed from the cottonwoods, a relentless pulse that matched the throbbing behind James's eyes. He wasn't supposed to be here. The supply order could have waited until next week, but the ranch had been too quiet lately, too full of memories that moved through the empty rooms like smoke. At 62, James had discovered that solitude and peace were not the same thing. The depot clerk, a nervous man named Hutchins with sweat stains spreading beneath his arms, barely glanced up from his ledger. "Afternoon, Mr. Callahan. Got your order ready. Fence wire, salt blocks, and—" "Fine." James's voice carried the rasp of decades spent outdoors, wind-scarred and sun-dried. "Load it up." He turned toward the wagon, already regretting the ride back in this heat, when he heard it. Faint, almost lost beneath the cicada noise. A wet, rattling cough that didn't belong. James stopped, listened. There it was again, coming from one of the sealed freight cars sitting on the siding. "Hutchins!" He didn't raise his voice, but the clerk's head snapped up anyway. "That car supposed to be sealed?" "Which? Oh, that one? Yeah, came through from Billings 3 days ago. Railroads got it marked for inspection before forwarding. Why?" Another cough. Weaker this time. James was moving before he'd made the conscious decision, his boots crunching across the gravel. The freight car sat baking in the sun, its wooden sides radiating heat. The seal was intact, railroad wax pressed with an official stamp. But James didn't hesitate. He pulled the knife from his belt and broke it. "Mr. Callahan, you can't just—" "Open it." Something in his tone made Hutchins swallow his protest. Together they wrestled with the door, rust-frozen runners shrieking until finally it gave way. The smell hit first. Urine, vomit, and the sickly sweet stench of fever sweat. The interior was an oven, easily 20 degrees hotter than the already brutal outside air. At first James thought the car was empty, just burlap sacks and broken crates. Then one of the sacks moved. She was small. So small that for a heartbeat James thought she might be a doll someone had discarded. But dolls didn't cough, didn't have skin flushed scarlet with heat stroke, didn't have lips cracked and bleeding from dehydration. 7 years old, maybe 8. Dark hair matted with sweat, a dress that might have been blue once but was now the color of road dust. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow and rapid. James climbed into the freight car, the heat immediately pressing against his lungs. He knelt beside her, one calloused hand touching her forehead. Burning. The child's skin was so hot it almost hurt to touch. Jesus. Hutchins had climbed up behind him. Is she alive? Barely. James slipped his arms beneath her, lifting her as carefully as he would a newborn calf. She weighed nothing. "How long did you say this car's been sitting here?" 3 days, but Mr. Callahan, we didn't know—" 3 days in this heat. James stepped toward the door, the child's head lolling against his shoulder. "And nobody thought to check inside a sealed car in the middle of summer? We're not supposed to break railroad seals without—" "Get me water, now." James carried her into the shade of the depot overhang and laid her on the wooden bench. Up close, he could see more, bruises on her arms, old ones fading to yellow-green, dirt under her fingernails. And pinned to the front of her dress, a scrap of paper with words scrawled in charcoal. No one's child. Something cold settled in James's chest as he unpinned the note. He'd seen a lot in his years as a bounty hunter, tracked men who'd done things that would make the devil flinch, but there was something about those 3 words that struck him harder than any bullet ever had. Hutchins returned with a canteen. James tilted it carefully against the child's lips, letting just a few drops of water slip into her mouth. Too much too fast would make her sick. She didn't swallow at first, and panic flickered through him. Had he been too late? But then her throat moved. Once. Twice. Her eyes fluttered open. Brown, he noted. Dark brown with flecks of gold, unfocused and confused. Easy, James said, his voice softer than he'd used in years. You're safe now. The child's gaze found his face. Her lips moved, forming a single word that came out as barely a whisper. Promise? The question hit him like a punch to the gut. When was the last time someone had asked him to promise them anything? When was the last time he'd been worth trusting? Yeah, he heard himself say, even though he knew better, even though promises were dangerous things. I promise. The girl's eyes closed again, but this time her breathing came easier. James kept giving her water, small sips every few minutes, while Hutchins stood nearby wringing his hands. Should I fetch Doc Morrison? Send someone and get the sheriff. The sheriff? But a child sealed in a freight car in 100-degree heat isn't an accident, Hutchins. Someone put her there. The clerk's face went pale. He nodded and hurried off, leaving James alone with the unconscious child. He studied her face, trying to reconcile the bruises with the careful mending on her dress. Someone had cared enough to patch the tear in the sleeve, even if they hadn't cared enough to keep her from ending up in a freight car. The cicadas continued their relentless song. James's knees ached from kneeling on the hard wood, but he didn't move. The child stirred occasionally, her fingers twitching like she was reaching for something that wasn't there. What happened to you? He murmured, more to himself than to her. Who would do this? She didn't answer, but her hand, small and hot and filthy, curled around his thumb with surprising strength, holding on. James Callahan, who'd spent the last 16 years keeping the world at arm's length, who'd built walls higher than his barn and twice as sturdy, who'd convinced himself that solitude was the same as safety, looked down at that small hand and felt something crack in his chest. Doc Morrison arrived 20 minutes later, his medical bag in hand and his face already set in the grim expression that meant he was preparing for the worst. He was a good man, Morrison, competent and discreet, which in Montana territory meant he knew when to heal and when to keep his mouth shut. James. He knelt beside the bench, already checking the child's pulse. Hutchins said you found her in a freight car? Sealed. 3 days in this heat. Morrison's jaw tightened. Lucky you heard her. Luck had nothing to do with it. James stood, his joints protesting, giving the doctor room to work. Can you help her? Heat stroke, severe dehydration, possibly exposure. Morrison pulled back one of the child's eyelids, studying her pupil. She needs constant care for the next 48 hours. Cool baths, steady hydration, monitoring for fever spikes. The hospital in Billings would be no hospitals. The words came out harder than James intended. I'll take her to the ranch. Morrison looked up, surprise flickering across his weathered face. James, I understand the sentiment, but this child needs round-the-clock medical attention. You're alone out there, and Clara's there. That gave Morrison pause. Clara Bennett, younger sister of James's late wife, Sarah, had been living at the ranch for the past year. She'd arrived unannounced after her husband's death, a widow in need of a place to heal, and James had given her the guest room without asking questions. They circled each other like cats, careful and cautious, but she was capable and strong-minded, and she knew about healing. Clara might help, Morrison conceded, but this is serious, James. This child could still die. Then she'll die somewhere clean and cool instead of in a county hospital that smells like carbolic and despair. James's voice was flat, allowing no argument. What supplies do you need? Morrison studied him for a long moment, then sighed. I'll make a list. But James, why? You don't know this child. You don't owe her anything. James looked down at the girl on the bench, at the note he'd crumpled in his fist, at the small hand that had held onto his thumb like he was the only solid thing in a spinning world. Maybe that's exactly why, he said quietly. Sheriff Tom Brennan arrived as Morrison was loading supplies into James's wagon. Tom was younger than James by 15 years, but he'd been sheriff long enough to have stopped believing in coincidences. Hutchins said you found a child in a freight car? Tom's hand rested on his gun belt, a casual gesture that didn't fool anyone. Mind if I take a look at her? Be my guest. James gestured to the wagon bed where he'd made a nest of blankets for the girl. But make it quick. She needs to get out of this heat. Tom climbed up, his expression darkening as he took in the child's condition. Jesus, Mary and Joseph. Someone sealed her in there deliberately? The note says she's nobody's child. Draw your own conclusions. What note? James handed it over. Tom read it twice, his face hardening with each word. This is attempted murder. That's why I sent for you. I'll need to investigate. Talk to the railroad, find out where this car originated, who had access. Tom stopped, meeting James's eyes. You planning to keep her? The question hung in the hot air between them. James hadn't thought that far ahead, hadn't planned anything beyond getting the child somewhere safe. But now that Tom had voiced it, he realized the answer had been forming since the moment those small fingers had wrapped around his thumb. Until we find out who she belongs to, James said carefully, and if nobody claims her, then I guess she belongs to me. Tom's eyebrows rose. James Callahan, lone wolf of Montana Territory, raising a child? No offense, but you haven't exactly been the nurturing type since Sarah died. James finished the sentence that Tom had been too polite to complete. I know. But that child asked me for a promise, Tom, and I gave it to her. What promise? That she was safe. Tom was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. All right. I'll do what I can to track down her family. But James, if this is what I think it is, if someone tried to kill this child, they might not be happy that she survived. Let them come. Something dangerous flickered in James's voice, an echo of the man he'd been before grief had dulled his edges. I've dealt with worse. The ride back to the ranch took 2 hours. James drove slowly, avoiding the worst of the ruts, one eye constantly checking the wagon bed where the child lay wrapped in damp cloths. Morrison had given her some kind of medicine that kept her sleeping, which was probably for the best. The less she moved, the less strain on her overtaxed system. The sun was starting its descent toward the mountains when the ranch house came into view. It sat in a valley between 2 hills, a 2-story structure built from local timber and river rock. Solid. Permanent. The kind of place meant to last generations, except James had no generations to pass it to. Until now. The thought came unbidden, and he pushed it away. He was getting ahead of himself. The child might not survive the night, and even if she did, Tom would likely find her family. James was just a temporary stop, a way station between one life and whatever came next. He kept telling himself that as he carried her inside. Clara was in the kitchen, her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, flour dusting her apron. She looked up as the door opened, a smile already forming, then froze when she saw what James carried. Dear God, James, what? Found her at the depot. Heat stroke and dehydration. Morrison says she needs constant care for the next 2 days. James moved past her toward the stairs. I'll need your help. To her credit, Clara didn't pepper him with questions. She simply wiped her hands on her apron and followed him up to the guest room, her room, where he laid the child on the bed. I'll need cool water, clean cloths, and whatever broth you have on hand, James said, falling back on the kind of clinical precision that had kept him alive during his hunting years. Morrison left laudanum for pain and willow bark for fever. We need to keep her temperature down and get fluids into her slowly. Clara was already moving, gathering supplies with the efficiency of a woman who'd nursed her share of sick relatives. But when she returned with a basin of water and a stack of cloths, she paused beside the bed, looking down at the child's face. She's so small, Clara whispered. Who is she? Don't know yet. She had this pinned to her dress. James handed over the note. Clara read it, and something flickered across her face. pain, recognition, something James couldn't quite name. Her hand went to her throat, to the place where she sometimes touched the locket that held a photograph of the daughter she'd lost to scarlet fever 3 years ago. "No one's child," she read aloud. "What kind of monster?" "The kind Tom Brennan's going to find." James's voice was hard. "Right now we focus on keeping her alive." They worked together through the evening and into the night. Clara bathed the child with cool water while James held her steady, monitoring her breathing and the rapid flutter of her pulse. They got broth into her, a spoonful at a time, and when her fever spiked near midnight, they packed her in wet sheets until it broke. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, Clara fell asleep in the chair beside the bed, her head tilted at an angle that would make her neck ache come morning. James covered her with a blanket, then settled into the other chair, watching the slow rise and fall of the child's chest. She looked different, clean, younger, more fragile. The bruises stood out in sharp relief against skin that was starting to lose its angry flush. Someone had hurt this child, repeatedly and deliberately. The bruises were too well placed, too carefully hidden beneath clothing. James had seen enough violence in his life to recognize its patterns. The child stirred, her eyes opening in the lamplight. She looked around the unfamiliar room with the confusion of someone who'd forgotten where she was. Then her gaze found James. "You're the man from before," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "The one who promised." "That's right." James leaned forward, keeping his movements slow and unthreatening. "How do you feel?" "Hot and thirsty." He helped her drink, supporting her head while she took small sips. When she'd had enough, she settled back against the pillows, studying him with those gold-flecked eyes. "What's your name?" she asked. "James Callahan. This is my ranch." "I'm Grace." She said it carefully, like she was testing the name to see if it still fit. Grace Bennett. Bennett. The same surname as Clara. Coincidence? James glanced at the sleeping woman in the chair, but Clara's face revealed nothing. "Do you remember what happened to you, Grace?" Her small face closed like a door slamming shut. "I don't want to talk about it." "That's all right." James kept his voice gentle. "But I need to know one thing. Do you have family? Someone who's looking for you?" Grace's eyes filled with tears that she blinked back furiously. "The note said I'm nobody's child." "The note was wrong." She looked at him, surprise and something that might have been hope flickering across her face. "It was?" "Yeah." James found himself reaching out, his weathered hand covering her small one. "Because right now, you're mine, and I keep my promises." The tears spilled over then, silent and steady, running down her cheeks like summer rain. James let her cry, understanding that some grief was too big for words, too deep for anything but salt water and time. When the tears finally stopped, Grace was asleep again, her hand still wrapped around his. James sat in the lamplight, listening to Clara's breathing and the child's and the night sounds outside. Crickets and coyotes, and the restless wind that never quite stopped moving across the Montana plains. He thought about the note, about someone who would seal a child in a freight car and leave her to die in the heat, about the bruises that spoke of systematic cruelty, about the way Grace had looked at him when he'd said the note was wrong, like she'd forgotten that anyone could contradict the labels the world pinned on them. James Callahan had spent 16 years running from responsibility, from connection, from anything that might crack the armor he'd built around himself after Sarah's death. He'd convinced himself that isolation was the same as strength, that needing nothing meant losing nothing. But as the night stretched toward dawn and the child slept on, her hand still holding his, James realized that some promises changed you the moment you made them. And maybe, just maybe, that wasn't always a bad thing. Clara woke with the first light, her neck protesting the awkward angle she'd slept at. She straightened slowly, working out the kinks, then froze when she saw James still sitting in the same position, the child's hand in his. "You didn't sleep," she said, her voice carrying the roughness of exhaustion. "Couldn't." "James, her name is Grace Bennett." He said it quietly, watching Clara's face. "That your family name?" Clara's hand went to her throat again, to the locket. "Bennett was my maiden name. My late husband was a Mitchell." "Coincidence?" I don't know." Clara moved to the bed, looking down at Grace's sleeping face. Bennett isn't uncommon, could be any number of families. But her voice wavered, uncertain. She's about 7 or 8, James continued, still watching Clara. Dark hair, brown eyes, looks a bit like you, actually, around the chin and forehead. Clara's breath caught. No, it can't be. She turned away, her hand pressed to her mouth. I had a niece, my brother David's daughter. But he and his wife moved to Oregon 4 years ago. We lost touch after my husband died. Oregon to Montana is not that far by railroad. But why would she be here? Why would anyone... Clara stopped, the horror of implication settling over her face. Oh, God. You don't think David and Martha are... I don't think anything yet, James said firmly. Tom's investigating. We'll know more soon. But Clara, if she is your niece, if she's family, then someone tried to kill my family. Clara's voice had gone cold, a tone James had never heard from her before. Someone put a child in a freight car to die. And she didn't die. James stood, his joints protesting the long night. She's here, she's alive, and whoever did this doesn't know it yet, which gives us an advantage. Clara looked at him, something shifting in her expression. You're going to hunt them. It wasn't a question. She'd lived at the ranch long enough to hear the stories, to know what James Callahan had been before grief made him into something smaller and sadder. The bounty hunter, the tracker, the man who'd brought in outlaws that other men couldn't find. Not yet, James said. First, we keep Grace alive. Then we find out who she is and why someone wanted her dead. And then his voice dropped, carrying the kind of promise that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with justice. Then I'll do what I do best. Grace stirred, her eyes opening slowly. She looked between James and Clara, confusion giving way to caution. Where am I? You're at the Callahan Ranch, Clara said, moving to sit on the edge of the bed. I'm Clara Mitchell. I've been staying here while, well, that doesn't matter right now. What matters is that you're safe. The man said that too. Grace's eyes found James. He promised. And I meant it. James crossed to the window, looking out at the ranch yard where morning light was starting to paint everything gold. Nobody's going to hurt you here, Grace. You have my word. Words don't always mean anything, Grace said quietly. People say things they don't mean all the time.
The
weight in those words, the kind of disillusionment that should have taken decades to accumulate, not 7 or 8 years, made James's chest tight. Some people do, he agreed, turning back to face her. But not me. When I give my word, it's iron. You understand? Whatever happens, whatever comes, you're under my protection now. Grace studied him with those old eyes in that young face. Why? Because someone has to, James said simply, and because you asked me to promise, and because... He stopped, surprised by the truth that wanted to come out. Because I know what it's like to be alone. Something in Grace's expression softened, just slightly. Not trust, not yet, but maybe the beginning of belief that trust might be possible. Clara cleared her throat. Are you hungry, Grace? I could make eggs and toast if your stomach can handle it. I'm hungry, Grace admitted. I don't remember the last time I ate. Then let's get some food into you. Clara stood, already moving toward the door. James, can you help her wash up? There's a basin and pitcher on the dresser. When Clara had gone, James helped Grace out of bed, steadying her when her legs wobbled. She'd been through hell, but there was strength in her still, the kind of resilience that came from surviving things that should have broken her. He turned his back while she washed, giving her what privacy he could, but he noticed how carefully she moved, how she favored her left side like something there hurt more than she wanted to admit. Grace, he said quietly, still facing away. The bruises on your arms. Who gave them to you? Silence, then so soft he almost missed it. It doesn't matter now. It matters to me. Why? You don't know me. Maybe not yet. James turned, meeting her eyes. But I'm going to. And part of knowing someone is understanding what they've survived. Grace pulled on the clean nightgown Clara had left for her, her movement slow and deliberate. When she was decent, she sat on the edge of the bed, her feet dangling above the floor. "My mother," she said finally. "After my father died, she married again. He seemed nice at first, but then—" She stopped, swallowing hard. He didn't like children, especially children who reminded him that my mother had loved someone else first. James felt something dark and cold settle in his gut. "Where's your mother now?" "I don't know. She got sick, real sick, and then one day he said she'd gone away, that she'd left because she didn't want me anymore." Grace's voice was flat, reciting facts like they were items on a grocery list. "He kept me locked in the cellar after that. Said I was too much trouble, too loud, too everything." "And the freight car?" "He said he was taking me to an orphanage, put me in the car with some water and bread, told me to be quiet or I'd regret it." Grace's fingers twisted in the nightgown. "But then the door closed and I heard the seal being applied. And I waited for the train to move, but it never did. It just sat there getting hotter and hotter and—" She broke off, her breath coming in short gasps. James moved to her side, not touching, but present. "You don't have to say more." "I tried to scream," Grace continued, like she needed to get it all out now before the words choked her. "But my throat was too dry and nobody could hear me anyway. I thought that was it, that I was going to die in that box and nobody would know or care." "Someone cared." James's voice was rough. "I cared. Clara cares. And Grace? Your stepfather lied. Your mother didn't leave you because she didn't want you. I'd bet everything I own that she's dead, and he killed her to get her out of the way." Grace looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. "How do you know?" "Because men like that don't just lock children in cellars and seal them in freight cars. They eliminate anyone who might stop them." James knelt so they were eye to eye. "But he didn't eliminate you. You survived. And now you're here, and you're safe, and I'm going to make sure he never touches you again. You can't promise that. You don't know—" "Grace Bennett." James's voice was iron and stone. "I spent 30 years tracking the worst men in 3 territories. I've faced down killers, thieves, and monsters in human skin. Your stepfather? He's just another name on a list. And I always find the names on my list." Something flickered in Grace's eyes. Hope, maybe, or the beginning of it. "What if he comes looking for me? Then he'll find me instead." James stood, offering her his hand. "Come on, Claire's got breakfast waiting, and you need to eat. We can talk more later, when you're stronger." Grace took his hand, letting him help her up. They walked to the door together, her small hand still clasped in his calloused one. At the threshold, she stopped. "Mr. Callahan?" "James. Just James." "James," she corrected, testing the name. "Thank you for not walking away." "Grace?" James waited until she looked up at him. "I don't walk away from my promises. Remember that." They went downstairs together, into the kitchen where Clara had set the table with eggs, toast, and fresh butter. The morning sun streamed through the windows, turning the room golden. Grace ate slowly, carefully, like someone who'd forgotten what it felt like to have enough. James watched her, aware of Clara watching both of them, and felt something shift in the stillness of the house. For 16 years, this place had been a tomb, beautiful and well-maintained, but empty of anything resembling life. He'd walked through rooms like a ghost, maintaining routines that had lost their meaning, keeping everything exactly as Sarah had left it, because changing anything felt like forgetting. But now there was a child at his table, eating his food, wearing one of Clara's nightgowns. A child who'd been sealed in a freight car to die. A child who'd survived anyway, through sheer stubborn refusal to give up. A child who'd looked at him with old eyes and asked him to promise. And James Callahan, who'd spent 16 years believing he had nothing left to give, discovered that promises had a way of bringing dead things back to life, even if those dead things were only his own heart. Outside, the cicadas began their daily song, and the Montana summer stretched on, relentless and burning. But inside the Callahan ranch, something had changed. Something fragile and new and dangerous, like the first green shoots pushing through scorched earth. Grace finished her breakfast and asked if she could see the ranch. Clara helped her dress in clothes that hung loose on her thin frame, and James led them both outside into the morning heat. The ranch sprawled across 200 acres of valley and hillside, pastures for cattle, fields for hay, a creek that ran year-round even in drought years. James had built most of it with Sarah, back when the future had seemed like something worth planning for. Grace stood on the porch, looking out at it all with an expression James couldn't quite read. Not wonder, exactly. More like someone seeing possibility for the first time in a long while. "Is it really yours?" she asked. "Every acre. And nobody can take it away?" The question was too specific, too weighted. James glanced at Clara, who'd gone still. "Nobody can take it," James confirmed. "It's mine free and clear. No debt, no loans, no one with a claim on it except me." He paused. "Why do you ask?" "My stepfather was always talking about land. About how if we just had land, we'd be important, we'd matter." Grace's voice was distant. "He tried to buy some, but nobody would sell to him. He got real angry about it." "What was your stepfather's name, Grace?" She hesitated, then whispered, "Cole. Marcus Cole." The name hit James like a fist to the gut. Clara gasped, one hand flying to her mouth. "Marcus Cole?" James repeated, his voice deadly quiet. "You're sure?" "That's what he told me to call him. Why? Do you know him?" James and Clara exchanged a look that carried 16 years of shared history, shared grief, and shared knowledge that some names were better left unspoken. "I know the name," James said finally, "but I need to be sure we're talking about the same man. What did he look like?" "Tall, brown hair going gray at the temples. He had a scar here." Grace touched her left eyebrow. "From a knife fight," he said, "and his eyes were wrong." "Wrong how?" "Like they were smiling when the rest of him wasn't. Like he was always laughing at a joke nobody else could hear." Ice settled in James's veins. That description matched perfectly. "Clara," he said quietly, "take Grace inside. I need to ride into town." "James!" "Now, Clara." Clara knew that tone. She gathered Grace and herded her back into the house, though not before throwing one more worried glance at James over her shoulder. When they were gone, James stood alone on his porch, looking out at the land he'd built, the life he'd carved from nothing, the peace he'd finally started to find after Sarah's death. Marcus Cole. Of all the names and all the territories, it had to be that one. Because Marcus Cole wasn't just a name. It was a ghost. A piece of the past James had thought he'd left buried. Marcus Cole was the younger brother of Daniel Garrett, the outlaw James had killed 16 years ago. And if Marcus Cole had Grace, if he'd married her mother and locked Grace in a cellar and sealed her in a freight car to die, then this wasn't about land or money or even simple cruelty. This was about revenge. And James Callahan, who'd spent 16 years trying to outrun his past, realized it had just caught up with him in the worst possible way. The ride to town took 90 minutes through heat that pressed down like a physical weight. James pushed his horse harder than he should have, dust rising in plumes behind them, but he couldn't shake the cold knot of dread that had settled in his chest the moment Grace spoke that name. Marcus Cole. 16 years. 16 years since James had tracked Daniel Garrett to a canyon in Wyoming and put a bullet through his heart. Garrett had been wanted for murder, robbery, and assault across 3 territories, a violent man who'd left a trail of bodies in his wake. James had done his job, collected his bounty, and never looked back. But he'd known Garrett had a younger brother. A boy, really, barely 16 at the time. James had seen him once, standing at the edge of the crowd when they brought Garrett's body back to town. The kid had watched with those cold eyes, not crying, not raging, just watching, calculating. James had dismissed him as a footnote, a mistake he was about to pay for. Sheriff Tom Brennan was at his desk when James walked into the office, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. Tom looked up, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun before he recognized the visitor. "Jesus, James, you scared the hell out of Marcus Cole." James planted both hands on the desk, leaning in. "Tell me everything you know about Marcus Cole." Tom blinked, taken aback by the intensity. "The county land agent? What about him?" "He's the one who sealed Grace in that freight car." The color drained from Tom's face. "What?" "James, are you sure? Marcus Cole is a respected county official. He's been helping widows keep their homesteads, working with the railroad to—" "Helping widows keep their homesteads?" James's laugh was bitter. "Tom, the child upstairs in my house just identified him as her stepfather. The man who locked her in a cellar. The man who married her mother and then that mother mysteriously disappeared. The man who put a 7-year-old girl in a sealed freight car and left her to cook to death in the Montana summer. Tom stood slowly, his lawman's instincts overriding his shock. You're certain it's the same man? Tall, brown hair graying at the temples, scar over his left eyebrow from a knife fight, eyes that smile when nothing else does. How many Marcus Coles match that description? Christ! Tom sat back down heavily. James, if what you're saying is true, it's true. Grace doesn't have any reason to lie. Then we've got a bigger problem than you realize. Tom pulled a ledger from his desk drawer, flipping it open. Marcus Cole has been county land agent for the past 8 years. In that time, he's handled hundreds of property transfers, estate settlements, widow claims. If he's been using that position to what? James's voice was deadly quiet. Tom looked up, his expression grim. 3 weeks ago, a widow named Martha Bennett came to see me. Said her land agent, Marcus Cole, was pressuring her to sign over her homestead rights. She had a daughter, she said, 7 years old, named Grace. Martha seemed scared, but she wouldn't tell me why. I told her to come back if Cole made any more threats. And did she? No. Tom's jaw clenched. 2 weeks ago, Martha Bennett was found dead in her cabin. Doc Morrison ruled it natural causes. Weak heart, he said. The daughter disappeared. Cole filed papers claiming the child had been sent to relatives back east. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. He killed her. Killed Martha to get her land, then tried to kill Grace to eliminate the only witness. We don't have proof. I don't need proof to know what happened. James straightened, his mind already racing ahead. But you do, so let's get it. Where's Cole now? He's got an office above the feed store. But James, you can't just storm in there and watch me. Tom grabbed his arm, holding him back with surprising strength. Listen to me. If Cole is really Daniel Garrett's brother, if this is about revenge for something that happened 16 years ago, then he's been planning this for a long time. He's not going to fold just because you show up angry. We need to be smart about this. James wanted to argue, wanted to ride straight to Cole's office and beat the truth out of him with his bare hands. But Tom was right. Rage was a luxury he couldn't afford, not when Grace's life might depend on him keeping his head. Fine. James forced himself to breathe, to think. What do you suggest? Let me investigate properly. I'll go through Cole's records, talk to other widows he's worked with, see if there's a pattern. If he's been stealing land systematically, there'll be evidence, paper trails he didn't think anyone would notice. How long will that take? A few days, maybe a week? Grace doesn't have a week. James's voice was flat. The moment Cole realizes she's alive, he'll come for her, or send someone else to finish what he started. Tom was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. Then we don't tell him she's alive. As far as anyone in town knows, that freight car was empty. Hutchins didn't see the girl, didn't know who you carried out. We can use that. Use it how? Cole thinks Grace is dead. That buys us time to build a case against him. But James... Tom's expression hardened. You need to keep her hidden. No one can know she's at your ranch. Not the neighbors, not the hands, not anyone. Because the minute word gets out, he'll know she survived. James finished the thought. And he'll come to finish the job. Exactly. James looked out the window at the dusty main street, at the people going about their business in the afternoon heat. Somewhere in this town, Marcus Cole was sitting in his office, believing he'd gotten away with murder, believing the witness was dead and buried and no one would ever know. How long have you known Cole? James asked. 8 years since he took the land agent position. He came from Denver with solid references, seemed competent and honest. Everyone likes him. Tom's voice turned bitter. Hell, I liked him. Never suspected. That's how the good ones work. They blend in, build trust, wait for the right moment. James had tracked enough criminals to recognize the pattern. Did Cole ever mention me? Ever ask about my past? Tom frowned, thinking back. Not that I recall. Why? Because if he's really Daniel Garrett's brother, then he knows who I am. Knows I'm the one who killed Daniel. And if he's been planning revenge for 16 years... James stopped, a new thought occurring to him. Tom, when did Martha Bennett buy her homestead? About 5 years ago, I think. Why? And where was it located? North Valley, up by... Tom's eyes widened. Jesus, it borders your property. The full picture crystallized with brutal clarity. Martha Bennett's land bordered the Callahan Ranch. Cole had married her, likely pressured her to sign documents that would transfer ownership upon her death. Then he'd killed her and tried to eliminate Grace, the only heir who could contest the transfer. But it wasn't just about Martha's 160 acres. It was about access, a foothold next to James's property, a way to get close. He's been setting this up for years, James said slowly, waiting for the right opportunity. Martha's homestead was just the beginning. The beginning of what? Of taking everything I have. My land, my home, my life. James met Tom's eyes. This isn't just about revenge for his brother. It's about destroying me piece by piece. And Grace, his voice hardened. Grace was supposed to be collateral damage, a loose end to tie up before moving on to the real target. Which is you. Which is me. Tom was quiet for a long moment, then reached for his gun belt. All right, here's what we're going to do. I'll start investigating Cole's land transfers quietly. See if I can find evidence of fraud or coercion. You keep Grace hidden at the ranch. Don't tell anyone she's there. Don't bring her to town. Don't even let your ranch hands see her if you can help it. Clara knows. Clara can keep a secret. Anyone else? Doc Morrison? Morrison's solid. He won't talk. Tom buckled his gun belt, his expression grim. But James, I need you to promise me something. Don't go after Cole directly. Not yet. Let me build the case properly so when we take him down, it sticks. Every instinct James had screamed against waiting, against giving Cole more time to plan and scheme. But Tom was right. A bullet would be too quick, too clean. Cole deserved to face justice publicly, to have his crimes exposed, to watch everything he'd built collapse around him. How long? James asked. Give me 3 days. If I can't find solid evidence by then I handle it my way. Tom didn't argue. He knew James well enough to recognize when pushing would only make things worse. 3 days. And James, watch your back. If Cole suspects Grace is alive, if he realizes you're on to him, let him try. James's voice carried the cold promise of violence barely leashed. I've been waiting 16 years for someone to give me a reason to be what I used to be. Cole just volunteered. He left the sheriff's office and walked to the general store, purchasing supplies he didn't really need, salt, flour, coffee, anything to maintain the appearance of normalcy. But his mind was elsewhere, cataloging threats and calculating responses. Marcus Cole, county land agent, respected citizen, murderer. And somewhere in this town, probably in his tidy office with his tidy records and his respectable facade, Cole was planning his next move. Because men like Cole always had a next move. The ride back to the ranch felt longer than the ride out, the afternoon heat oppressive and thick. James's horse was lathered and tired by the time they reached the barn. He unsaddled and brushed the animal down himself, using the routine to settle his thoughts. Clara was waiting on the porch when he walked up to the house. One look at his face told her everything she needed to know. It's bad, she said quietly. Worse than bad. James dropped into the chair beside her, suddenly feeling every one of his 62 years. Grace's stepfather is Marcus Cole, Daniel Garrett's younger brother. Clara's hand flew to her mouth. Oh God, James, it means he's been planning this for 16 years. It means Martha Bennett didn't die of natural causes, and it means Grace was never meant to make it out of that freight car alive. What are we going to do? Keep her hidden, keep her safe, and give Tom 3 days to build a case against Cole. James looked at Clara, his expression serious. No one can know she's here, Clara. Not your friends in town, not the neighboring ranchers, not anyone. If word gets out, I understand. Clara's voice was steady despite the fear in her eyes. Is she really my niece? My brother David's daughter? I don't know. The name matches, and there's something in her features that looks like your family, but we won't know for certain until we find out what happened to David and his wife. If Martha was David's wife, if Grace is David's daughter, then Cole didn't just kill a stranger. He killed my brother's widow. He tried to kill my niece. Clara's voice shook with barely contained rage. James, if that's true, then we make sure he pays for it, all of it. But first we keep Grace alive long enough to see justice done. They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun slide toward the mountains. Inside the house, James could hear Grace moving around, the light footsteps of a child exploring a space that felt safe enough to explore. "She trusts you," Clara said softly. "I've been watching her. She follows you with her eyes whenever you're in the room, like she's afraid if she looks away you'll disappear. Kids who've been abandoned learn to hold on tight to anyone who shows them kindness. It's more than that." Clara turned to look at him. "She asked me this morning if you were going to send her away. If this was just temporary until you found somewhere else to put her." James felt something twist in his chest. "What did you tell her?" "I told her the truth, that you're a man who keeps his promises, and that you promised her she was safe here." Clara paused. "But James, what happens when this is over? When Cole is dealt with and the danger has passed? What happens to Grace then?" It was the question James had been avoiding since the moment he'd lifted Grace out of that freight car. The practical question, the question that required thinking beyond the immediate crisis to something that looked like a future. "I don't know," he admitted. "If we find her real family, if there are relatives who want her, and if there aren't?" James didn't answer, couldn't answer, because the truth was complicated and frightening, and it involved opening doors he'd kept locked for 16 years. Clara stood, brushing dust from her skirt. "I'm going to start dinner. Grace helped me make bread this afternoon. She's got good hands for kneading. Strong, despite everything." She paused at the door. "James, whatever you decide about Grace's future, make sure you're deciding for the right reasons. Not because you feel obligated, and not because you're trying to replace what you lost with Sarah. I'm not... Just think about it." Clara's voice was gentle but firm. "That child deserves more than someone who's keeping her out of guilt or duty. She deserves someone who actually wants her, who chooses her, who sees her as more than a second chance at something that's already gone." She went inside, leaving James alone with thoughts that cut deeper than he wanted to admit. Was he trying to replace Sarah's memory? Was his promise to Grace born from genuine care or from some desperate attempt to fill the emptiness that had been eating at him for years? He didn't have answers. But he knew one thing with certainty. When he'd looked into Grace's eyes and promised her safety, something had shifted inside him. Something that felt less like obligation and more like purpose. The next 3 days passed with agonizing slowness. James threw himself into ranch work, mending fences and checking cattle, and doing all the physical labor that usually helped quiet his mind. But this time, the work only gave him more time to think, to worry, to imagine all the ways Cole might strike if he discovered Grace was alive. Grace herself seemed to blossom in the safety of the ranch. She followed Clara around the kitchen, learning to cook and bake. She sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. She asked questions about everything, the cattle, the horses, the way the ranch operated, but she never asked about her mother, never mentioned Marcus Cole. It was like those memories existed behind a locked door she wasn't ready to open. On the second day, Tom rode out to the ranch after dark, his face grim in the lamplight. "I found something," he said, spreading papers across James's kitchen table. "Cole's been working a scheme for at least 6 years. He targets widows or single women with good land and no family support, offers to help them with paperwork, estate settlements, property disputes, gains their trust." "And then?" Clara asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. "Then the women start signing documents they don't fully understand, power of attorney forms, land transfers that only take effect upon death. Within 6 months to a year, the women die. Always from natural causes, according to Doc Morrison's predecessor, who retired 2 years ago under mysterious circumstances." James studied the papers. 12 names, 12 women, 12 deaths. And in each case, the land had ended up in Marcus Cole's hands or sold to associates for far below market value. "Martha Bennett is just the most recent," Tom continued. "But James, there's more. I dug into Cole's background before he came to Montana. He did time in a Colorado prison for fraud and assault, served 3 years, got out with a new name and forged references." "His real name?" James asked, though he already knew. "Marcus Garrett, Daniel Garrett's younger brother." Tom's voice was heavy. "He changed it to Cole when he got out of prison, started fresh, worked his way into county government, and based on property records, he's been slowly buying up land around your ranch for the past 4 years. Clara's eyes widened. He's been planning to go after James all along. That's my theory. Martha's homestead was the last piece he needed to have property on 3 sides of the Callahan ranch. If he could isolate James, cut off access, make life difficult enough, he thought I'd sell. James finished the thought. Or die trying to hold on. Either way, he wins. Except Grace survived. Tom gathered the papers, which means he left a witness, a loose end. And men like Cole don't leave loose ends untied. Have you confronted him yet? James asked. Not yet. I wanted to talk to you first, see if there's anything we're missing. Tom hesitated. James, I know you want to handle this personally, but these documents are solid evidence. We can arrest Cole, try him properly, make sure he hangs for what he's done. James looked at the list of names. 12 women, 12 murders, and God knew how many children left orphaned or worse. Do it, he said finally. Arrest him. But Tom, when you do, I want to be there. I want him to know that Grace survived, that everything he's planned for 16 years has failed. Tom nodded. Tomorrow morning. I'll bring 2 deputies and we'll take him at his office. You can watch from across the street if you want, but James, stay out of it. Let the law handle this. After Tom left, James sat at the table staring at those names until the lamplight made his eyes ache. Clara had gone to bed. Grace was asleep upstairs. The house was quiet except for the usual settling sounds and the distant cry of coyotes. He thought about Daniel Garrett dying in that Wyoming canyon with James's bullet in his heart. He thought about Marcus, 16 years old and watching from the crowd with those calculating eyes. He thought about all the years in between, all the patient planning, all the women who'd died so Marcus could slowly build his revenge. And he thought about Grace, asking him to promise. A child who'd been nothing more than a means to an end in Marcus Cole's grand scheme. Disposable. Forgettable. No one's child. James stood and walked upstairs quietly, pausing outside the guest room door. Inside, he could hear Grace's steady breathing. Clara had left the lamp burning low, just enough light to keep the shadows at bay. He pushed the door open carefully. Grace was curled on her side, one hand tucked under her cheek, her dark hair spread across the pillow. She looked peaceful, safe, like a child who'd finally stopped running. Clara's words echoed in his mind. That child deserves someone who actually wants her, who chooses her. James had spent 16 years believing his life was over, that the best of him had died with Sarah, and all that remained was going through the motions until time ran out. He'd built walls, kept people at arm's length, convinced himself that isolation was the same as strength. But looking at Grace sleeping in the lamplight, he realized Clara was right about one thing. This wasn't about replacing what he'd lost. It was about recognizing what he'd found. A second chance, not at the life he'd had, but at a life he'd never imagined possible, if he let himself want it. The next morning dawned clear and hot, the kind of day that promised to bake everything under a merciless sun. James was up before first light, checking weapons he hadn't touched in years. His old Colt revolver, cleaned and oiled, the Winchester rifle that had brought down more outlaws than he cared to count, the knife that had saved his life in close quarters more times than was comfortable to remember. Clara found him in the barn, surrounded by his arsenal. Planning a war? She asked quietly. Planning for the possibility of one. James slid the Colt into its holster, feeling the familiar weight settle against his hip. Tom's arresting Cole this morning. Should be straightforward, but you don't trust straightforward anymore. Not when it comes to Marcus Cole. James checked the rifle's action, satisfied with the smooth click. He's had 16 years to plan this. I doubt he'll go quietly just because Tom shows up with arrest warrants. Then why are you going? Let Tom handle it. Because I need Cole to see me. Need him to know that Grace survived, that his plan failed, that I'm the reason why. James met Clara's eyes. Call it vanity or revenge or whatever you want. But that man has been orchestrating this for 16 years, and he deserves to know exactly how and why it fell apart. Clara was quiet for a moment, then nodded. When will you be back? By noon, if everything goes according to plan. James paused. If I'm not back by sundown, don't. Clara's voice was sharp. Don't start making contingency plans like you're not coming back. Grace has already lost enough people. She doesn't need to lose you too. The words hit harder than James expected. He realized with sudden clarity that somewhere in the past 3 days, he'd stopped thinking of Grace as a temporary responsibility and started thinking of her as something more permanent. Something that looked suspiciously like family. "I'll be careful," he promised. "You better be, because that child upstairs is already calling you James like you're hers, and I'll be damned if I'm the one who has to tell her you're not coming home." James rode into town slowly, taking his time, his eyes scanning every building and alley for signs of trouble. Tom had said 10 o'clock. The town clock showed 9:45. He tied his horse across the street from the feed store, in the shade of the bank building where he had a clear view of Cole's office. The second-floor windows were open to catch any hint of breeze, curtains moving lazily in the still air. Tom appeared at 5 minutes to 10, flanked by 2 deputies James recognized, solid men, competent with guns and smart enough to follow orders. They climbed the exterior stairs to Cole's office, their boots loud on the wooden steps. James's hand rested on his Colt, ready but not drawing. Waiting. The office door opened. Tom went in first. The deputies followed. For a long moment, nothing. Then voices, Tom's steady and official, another voice responding with confusion that sounded almost genuine. Then gunfire. 3 shots in rapid succession, then shouting. One of the deputies stumbled backward out the door, blood spreading across his shoulder. Tom's voice rose above the chaos. "He's running! Backstairs!" James was moving before conscious thought, vaulting onto his horse and spurring around the building. He reached the back alley just as a figure burst from the rear entrance, Marcus Cole, gun in hand, eyes wild. For a frozen second, they stared at each other across 20 feet of dusty alley. Recognition flared in Cole's eyes. Then rage. "You!" Cole's voice shook with 16 years of hatred. "You're supposed to be broken, destroyed. Everything you loved was supposed to be ashes." "Funny thing about ashes," James said, his voice deadly calm. "Sometimes they're just fertilizer for something new. The girl's dead. I made sure Grace is alive, safe, and ready to testify about everything you did to her mother." The color drained from Cole's face. For just a moment, the mask of respectability cracked completely, revealing the monster beneath. "That's not possible. She should have died in that freight car, should have cooked to death in the heat, but she didn't. She survived, because I found her." James's hand moved toward his gun. "And now you're going to answer for what you did. To Martha, to Grace, to all those other women." Cole's laugh was unhinged. "You think you've won? You think this is over? I've been planning this for 16 years, Callahan. 16 years of patience, of building, of waiting for the perfect moment. One setback doesn't... It's not a setback. It's the end." Tom's voice came from behind Cole, backed by the sound of multiple guns cocking. "Drop the weapon, Marcus. Or should I say Marcus Garrett?" Cole spun, bringing his gun up. 3 shots rang out simultaneously. Cole dropped, blood spreading across his chest. He fell to his knees, then onto his face in the dust. Tom approached carefully, kicking Cole's gun away. He checked for a pulse, then looked up at James and shook his head. Dead. 16 years of planning, of plotting, of patient revenge. Over in seconds. James should have felt satisfaction, relief, something. But all he felt was tired. Tom walked over, holstering his gun. "You all right?" "Fine. Your deputy?" "Shoulder wound. He'll live." Tom looked down at Cole's body. "Found letters in his office, detailed plans about how he was going to destroy you, maps of your property, schedules of your movements. James, he's been watching you for years." "I know." James had felt it sometimes, that sense of being observed. He'd dismissed it as paranoia. "Did you find anything about Martha Bennett, about what he did to her?" "Enough." Tom's voice was grim. "Receipts for arsenic purchased under a false name. Letters between Cole and a doctor in Billings discussing how to make poisoning look like heart failure. He kept everything, like trophies." "What about Grace? Any mention of her real family?" "Martha's maiden name was Bennett. She had a brother named David who moved to Oregon with his wife 4 years ago." Tom pulled out a folded paper. "Found a letter from David to Martha dated 6 months ago. He and his wife died in a house fire. They had a daughter named Grace who was supposed to be living with Martha. The pieces fell into place. Martha's brother and sister-in-law dead. Martha taking in her orphan niece. Cole seeing an opportunity. Marry the widow, eliminate the child, take the land. Clean, simple, monstrous. So Grace really is Clara's niece, James said quietly. Looks like it, which means she has family, people who'll want her. Tom didn't say it, but James heard the implication. People who had more claim to Grace than an aging rancher who'd only known her for 3 days. We'll see, was all James said. Right now I need to get home and tell Grace that Cole won't be coming for her, that she's really, truly safe. He rode home through heat that felt less oppressive than before, like something had broken in the atmosphere and the world could breathe again. When he reached the ranch, Clara and Grace were waiting on the porch. Grace ran to meet him, her small face tight with worry. You're back. Clara said you'd be back, but I was scared. James dismounted and knelt so they were eye to eye. I'm back. And Grace? It's over. Cole's dead. He can't hurt you anymore. The child's eyes filled with tears. Really? You promise? I promise. Grace threw her arms around his neck, holding on with desperate strength. James wrapped his arms around her, feeling her shake with sobs that were part relief and part grief for everything she'd lost. Over Grace's head, he met Clara's eyes. She was crying too, silently, her hand pressed to her heart. And James Callahan, who'd spent 16 years believing he had nothing left to give, held a child who wasn't his by blood, but was becoming his in every way that mattered, and realized that sometimes promises changed everything, even the ones you never expected to keep. Grace finally pulled back from the embrace, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Her face was blotchy and tear-streaked, but something in her expression had changed, a tension she'd been carrying since the freight car had finally released its grip. What happens now? She asked, her voice small but steady. It was the question James had been dreading. Clara moved closer, standing beside them, waiting for his answer. Now we figure out what comes next, James said carefully. Tom found some things in Cole's office, letters and documents. Grace, your mother's brother, your Uncle David, he and his wife died in Oregon about 6 months ago. That's why you came to live with your mother. Grace nodded slowly. Mama told me. She cried for days when she got the letter. Uncle David was her only family left. Which means, Clara's voice was gentle but firm. Which means I'm your family too, Grace. David Bennett was my brother. That makes you my niece. The child looked between them, confusion and something that might have been hope warring in her eyes. But you said your name was Mitchell. Bennett was my maiden name before I married. Your Uncle David was my older brother. Clara knelt beside James, reaching out to touch Grace's hand. I didn't know about you until a few days ago. Didn't know David had a daughter. Didn't know he and his wife had died. Didn't know your mother had remarried or that she'd... Her voice broke. I'm so sorry, Grace. If I'd known, I would have come for you. I would never have let any of this happen. Grace was quiet for a long moment, processing. Then, in a voice that carried more wisdom than any 7-year-old should possess, she said, It's not your fault. You couldn't have known. Mama said she lost touch with everyone after she married my first father. Said it was easier to start fresh than to explain why she'd married a man nobody approved of. Your first father? James asked gently. Grace, do you remember him? A little. He died when I was 4. Mama said he was a good man, just unlucky. He tried to farm land that wouldn't grow anything, borrowed money he couldn't pay back, worked himself to death trying to make it right. Grace's fingers twisted in her dress, the same nervous gesture James had noticed before. That's when Marcus came. He seemed kind at first, helped Mama with the debts, fixed things around the house. Mama thought... She stopped, swallowing hard. Mama thought he'd take care of us, but he only wanted the land. And when your mother wouldn't give it to him? Clara prompted softly. He got mean, started locking me in the cellar when Mama wasn't looking, telling me it was because I was bad. Then Mama got sick, and he said the doctor was too expensive, that we'd just have to wait and see if she got better. Grace's voice went flat, the way it did when she talked about things too painful to feel. She didn't get better. She got worse and worse, and then one morning she was just gone. Marcus said she died in the night, said it was her heart. James and Clara exchanged a look. The arsenic. The doctor in Billings, who'd been paid to make murder look natural. Cole had refined his method over years, perfecting it on 12 other women before he'd used it on Martha Bennett. After that, Marcus changed completely, Grace continued, her words coming faster now, like she needed to get them out before they choked her. He said, I was a burden, that Mama had been stupid to take me in, that nobody wanted a child who wasn't even blood. He kept me locked up most of the time. I wasn't allowed to go to school or church or anywhere people might see me. He said if I told anyone, he'd make sure I ended up in an orphanage where they beat children who caused trouble. But you didn't tell anyone, James said quietly. Who would have believed me? Marcus was important, respected, and I was just... She gestured at herself, encompassing all the ways the world had taught her she didn't matter. I was nobody's child. That's what the note said. The note was wrong, James said for the second time, his voice carrying absolute conviction. You're not nobody's child, Grace. You're Clara's niece. You're the daughter of Martha Bennett and the granddaughter of people who loved you even if you never got to meet them. And right now, in this moment, you're under my protection. That makes you somebody very important. Grace looked up at him, those old eyes searching his face for lies or false comfort. Whatever she found there must have satisfied her because she nodded, a small movement that carried the weight of tentative belief. Clara stood, brushing dust from her skirt. I think we all need something to eat. Grace, will you help me make lunch? I was thinking about teaching you how to make my grandmother's chicken and dumplings. Your grandmother was my grandmother too, Grace said slowly, testing out the connection. That's right. Which means you have a right to know her recipes, family recipes. Clara held out her hand. Come on. We'll let James clean up and rest, and by the time he's done, we'll have food ready. Grace took Clara's hand and let herself be led inside, but she glanced back at James one more time before disappearing through the door, checking, making sure he was still there. James sat on the porch steps, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had carried him through the confrontation with Cole had burned off, leaving him hollow and shaky. He pulled off his hat and ran a hand through his hair, feeling every one of his 62 years. The sound of feminine voices drifted from the kitchen, Clara's patient instructions and Grace's careful questions. Normal sounds, domestic sounds, the kind of sounds that used to fill this house before Sarah died. He thought about what came next. Cole was dead, but his crimes would need to be documented, investigated, made public. There would be inquiries and paperwork and legal proceedings. Martha Bennett's estate would need to be settled. The other widows' families would need to be notified that their loved ones had been murdered, that the deaths ruled natural had been anything but. And Grace would need to be placed somewhere permanent, with family. Clara had the strongest claim, blood relation, capable of providing care, already bonded with the child. It made sense for Grace to stay with Clara, either here at the ranch or wherever Clara decided to settle. The thought of Clara leaving, taking Grace with her, created an unexpected ache in James's chest. In just 3 days, the child had worked her way past his defenses, finding spaces in his heart he'd thought were sealed permanently. But what right did he have to keep her? He was an aging rancher with no experience raising children, no family to help him, nothing to offer but land and cattle and memories of a life that had ended 16 years ago. Grace deserved more than that, deserved a real family, people who knew how to be what she needed, even if the thought of letting her go felt like losing Sarah all over again. He was still sitting there, wrestling with thoughts that had no good answers, when Tom arrived an hour later. The sheriff looked tired, his face drawn and his clothes dusty from the ride. Thought you'd want an update, Tom said, dismounting and tying his horse to the rail. We searched Cole's office thoroughly, found enough evidence to hang him 3 times over, if he wasn't already dead. The other women? James asked. Documented, letters, receipts, copies of forged documents. He kept everything, like I said, either as trophies or insurance, I'm not sure which. Tom settled onto the porch step beside James. We've identified all 12 victims. I'll be sending telegrams to their families, letting them know what really happened. Some of them have children who were told their mothers died naturally. They deserve to know the truth. And the land Cole stole? That's where it gets complicated. Some of it was sold to associates who may or may not have known it was fraudulent. Some of it's still in Cole's name or tied up in holding companies. It's going to take months, maybe years, to sort out. Tom pulled off his hat, wiping sweat from his forehead. But Martha Bennett's homestead is straightforward. She died without a will, which means the property goes to her legal heir. That's Grace. James looked up sharply. Grace owns the land? Every acre. Cole never managed to finalize the transfer before he sealed her in that freight car, which means a 7-year-old child now owns 160 acres adjacent to your property. Tom's expression was neutral, but his eyes were sharp. Of course, she's too young to manage it herself. She'll need a legal guardian to make decisions until she comes of age. The implication hung in the air between them. Guardian. Legal authority. Permanent responsibility. Clara's her blood relative, James said. She'd be the logical choice. Clara would be one option, Tom agreed carefully. But James, guardianship isn't just about blood. It's about who can provide the best home, who the child trusts, who's willing to take on the responsibility long term. The court would consider all those factors. You're saying I could... James stopped, the words catching in his throat. I'm saying you should think about what you want, not just what makes sense on paper, but what you actually want. Tom stood, settling his hat back on his head. Grace has been through hell. She needs stability, safety, someone who sees her as more than an obligation. From what I've seen, she's already chosen who that person is. Question is whether you're ready to choose her back. He left James sitting on the porch, wrestling with a question that felt too big and too important to answer without certainty. Inside, Clara was teaching Grace how to roll dumpling dough, their hands working in tandem, flour dusting the table in their aprons. Grace's tongue stuck out slightly in concentration, her small hands carefully following Clara's demonstrations. Like this? Grace asked, holding up a misshapen dumpling. Perfect, Clara said warmly. Your first batch is always a little rough, but that's how you learn. By the time you're my age, you'll be able to make dumplings in your sleep. Will I still be here when I'm your age? The question was asked casually, but James heard the weight beneath it. Clara's hand stilled. I don't know, sweetheart. That depends on a lot of things. Like what? Like where you want to be, who you want to be with, what makes you feel safest. Clara resumed rolling dough, her movements careful and deliberate. Grace, you know I'm your aunt, your blood family. If you wanted to stay with me wherever I end up, you'd be welcome, more than welcome. You'd be wanted. Grace was quiet, rolling her own piece of dough with exaggerated focus. And if I wanted to stay here, on the ranch? Then we'd have to talk to James about that, see if it's something he wants too. He promised I was safe here. Safe and staying permanently are different things, Clara said gently. James is a good man, but he's been alone a long time. Taking on a child, raising you properly, that's a big responsibility. It's okay if he's not ready for that. But what if I want him to be ready? Grace's voice was small, almost breaking. What if I don't want to go somewhere else and start over again with people who don't know me? What if I want to stay here where I can see the mountains and help with the cattle and learn to make dumplings in the kitchen where it smells like bread and coffee? Clara pulled Grace into a hug, getting flour on both of them. Oh, sweetheart, I know this is hard. I know you want everything to be settled and safe and permanent right now. But these things take time. Adults have to figure out what's best, what's legal, what's possible. Adults always say that, Grace mumbled into Clara's shoulder. But what they mean is they're going to do what they want and tell me it's for my own good. The cynicism in those words, the hard-earned knowledge that adults couldn't be trusted to keep children's best interests at heart, cut through James like a knife. He stood in the doorway, unseen, listening to his own doubts voiced by a 7-year-old who'd learned too young that the world didn't care what children wanted. Clara saw him first, her eyes meeting his over Grace's head. The question in her expression was clear. What are you going to do? James stepped into the kitchen, his boots loud on the wooden floor. Grace pulled away from Clara, wiping her eyes quickly, trying to hide the tears. Grace, James said, and something in his tone made both of them turn to face him fully. I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen carefully. The child's face went carefully blank, bracing for disappointment, for rejection, for all the things adults said when they were about to send you away. I made you a promise 3 days ago, James continued, moving to the table but not sitting, needing to stand for this. I promised you were safe, and I meant it, but I think maybe I didn't promise enough. Grace's eyes widened slightly. Clara stayed very still, hardly breathing. Here's the thing about promises, James said, choosing his words with the same care he'd once used to track dangerous men through dangerous country. Some promises are temporary. I promise to fix your wagon. I promise to help you through this crisis. Those promises have endpoints, but other promises, the important ones, those don't have endpoints. Those are the ones you make knowing they'll change your whole life. He knelt down so he was at Grace's eye level, his knees protesting but holding firm. Grace Bennett, I want to make you that second kind of promise. Not just that you're safe, but that you have a home. Here, permanently, if that's what you want. The child stared at him, afraid to believe. You mean, I want to be your guardian, legal and permanent. I want you to stay here on this ranch and learn to ride horses and help with the cattle and make dumplings in this kitchen. I want you to go to school and make friends and have the kind of childhood you should have had all along. James's voice roughened. I want you to be my daughter, Grace, not because I feel obligated and not because I'm trying to replace someone I lost, but because in 3 days you've made this house feel less like a tomb and more like a home, and I don't want to go back to the silence. Tears spilled down Grace's cheeks, but she was smiling through them. Really? You really mean it? I really mean it, but Grace… James held up a hand, needing her to understand the full picture. Clara is your blood family, your real aunt. If you'd rather be with her, if you'd feel safer with someone who actually knows how to raise children, I'll understand. This has to be your choice. Grace looked at Clara, uncertainty flickering across her face. Clara smiled, even as her own eyes filled with tears. Grace, honey, I love you. You're my brother's child, and that makes you precious to me, Clara said, her voice steady despite her tears. But James is right. This has to be your choice. If you want to stay here with James, I'll stay too for as long as you need me. I'll help raise you, teach you about your family, make sure you know where you come from. But if you'd rather come with me when I eventually find my own place, that's all right too. Either way, you'll have family, people who want you, people who choose you. Grace looked between them, her small face serious as she weighed a decision no child should have to make. In the silence, a fly buzzed against the window, and the chicken simmered on the stove, and somewhere outside a horse whinnied to be led into the barn. Finally, Grace turned back to James. Can I ask you something? Anything. If I stay, if you're my guardian, does that mean you're like my father? James felt his throat tighten. If that's what you want it to mean. And you won't send me away if I'm bad or if I cause trouble or if I'm too much work? Never? And you'll teach me things? Ranch things and life things and how to be strong like you? Every single thing I know. Grace nodded slowly, coming to some internal decision. Then I want to stay. I want… Her voice broke, and she had to start again. I want to stay here with you and Clara and learn to be a rancher's daughter because this feels like home, and I haven't felt like I had a home in a very long time. James pulled her into a hug, and this time when she wrapped her arms around his neck, it felt different. Not the desperate grip of someone afraid of being abandoned, but the secure hold of someone who knew they belonged. Clara wiped her eyes with her apron, smiling through her tears. Well then, I guess that's settled. James Callahan, you just became a father. And Grace Bennett, you just became the luckiest girl in Montana because you're going to grow up learning from 2 people instead of 1. You're staying? Grace pulled back to look at Clara, hope and fear mingling in her expression. For as long as you need me, Clara confirmed, someone has to make sure James doesn't teach you to be too much like him. You need some civilizing influence. James snorted. I'm civilized. You track mud through my clean kitchen and eat standing at the stove. You're barely domesticated. But Clara's tone was fond, and the tension that had existed between them for the past year had shifted into something that looked like genuine family. The rest of the day passed in a strange combination of normalcy and transformation. They ate Clara's chicken and dumplings at the kitchen table, the 3 of them fitting together in a configuration that felt both new and inevitable. Grace asked questions about the ranch, about the cattle, about what she'd be allowed to do now that this was officially her home. Can I learn to ride? She asked, her eyes bright with possibility. Every rancher needs to know how to ride, James confirmed. We'll start with the gentlest mare, work you up to something with more spirit as you get comfortable. Can I help with the cattle? Once you're strong enough, ranching's hard work, Grace. You'll earn every skill you learn. Good. Grace's chin came up, stubborn and determined. I don't want anything given to me just because I'm a child. I want to work for it. James recognized that pride, that need to prove worth through action rather than charity. It was the same drive that had kept him working this ranch alone for 16 years rather than hiring help or admitting he needed support. After dinner, while Clara washed dishes and Grace dried them with careful attention, Tom returned with a leather folder full of documents. Brought the paperwork for guardianship, he said, spreading forms across the now clean kitchen table. It's not complicated legally since there's no other family contesting it, but you'll need to appear before Judge Harrison next week to make it official. Both you and Clara, since she's the blood relative and you're the proposed guardian. James scanned the documents, his weathered hands handling the papers carefully. And Martha's estate? Grace's inheritance? That'll take longer to settle, but the land is clear. Once you're Grace's legal guardian, you'll manage her property until she comes of age. You'll need to file an accounting with the court annually, show you're managing her assets appropriately, but that's standard procedure. Tom glanced at Grace, who was pretending not to listen while hanging on every word. Grace, you understand what's happening here? That James is going to be responsible for you, make decisions about your schooling and your property and your future? Grace looked up from the dish she was drying. He's going to be my father. That's what people who are responsible for children are called. Tom smiled. Fair enough. Just wanted to make sure you understood this isn't temporary. Once this is legal, it's permanent, unless circumstances change dramatically. Circumstances won't change, Grace said with absolute conviction. I'm staying here. This is my home now. The certainty in her voice, the complete absence of doubt, made something warm unfurl in James's chest. He'd spent 3 days terrified of letting himself want this, convinced he'd find some way to fail her. But looking at Grace standing in his kitchen with a dish towel in her hands and flowers still dusting her nose, he realized the fear had been backwards. It wasn't whether he could be enough for her. It was whether he could live with himself if he didn't try. Tom left after making arrangements for the court appearance, and the evening settled into comfortable routine. Clara read to Grace from a book of frontier stories while James sat in his chair, ostensibly reviewing ranch accounts, but mostly just listening to their voices blend in the lamplight. When Grace's eyes started drooping, Clara took her upstairs to prepare for bed. James heard water running, quiet conversation, the comfortable sounds of nighttime rituals. He found himself standing at the base of the stairs when Clara called down, James, Grace wants to say goodnight. He climbed the stairs, his joints aching from the long day's tension, and found Grace already in bed. Her dark hair spread across the pillow just like that first night when he'd watched her sleep and wondered if she'd survive until morning. Thank you, Grace said quietly as he settled into the chair beside her bed. For choosing me. Thank you for choosing me back, James replied. Grace, I want you to know something. I'm going to make mistakes. I don't know how to be a father. I never had children with my wife. I'll probably be too strict sometimes and too lenient others. I'll say the wrong things and miss cues and generally muddle through this the best I can. That's okay, Grace said, her eyes already half closed. I don't know how to be a daughter either. We can learn together. The simplicity of it, the grace in that acceptance, made James's throat tight. He reached out and brushed hair back from her forehead, the gesture feeling both foreign and natural. Sleep well, daughter, he said, testing out the word. Grace smiled, her eyes closing fully. Good night, Papa. The word hit him like a physical blow. Papa. Not James, not Mr. Callahan, but Papa. A title he'd never expected to earn, given freely by a child who'd had every reason to distrust adults and their promises. He sat there long after her breathing evened into sleep, watching the lamplight play across her peaceful face, marveling at the strange turns life could take. 3 days ago, he'd been alone, bitter, convinced his best years were behind him. Now he was responsible for a human life, a child who would need him to be better than he'd been, stronger than he felt, more present than he'd allowed himself to be in 16 years. It should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like coming back to life after a long, numb sleep. Clara was waiting in the hallway when he finally emerged from Grace's room. She'd let her hair down, and in the dim light she looked younger, less worn by the griefs that had brought her to his door a year ago. "Papa?" she said softly, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "That didn't take long." "She needed to call me something," James said, defensive. "She chose well." Clara leaned against the wall, studying him. "You know what you've taken on, don't you? This isn't just providing shelter and food. She's going to need schooling, friends, guidance through all the things young girls face growing up. She'll need to learn social graces, how to navigate the world as a woman, things you can't teach her." "That's why you're staying." James met her eyes. "I meant what I said earlier, Clara. I need your help with this. Grace needs you, not just now, but ongoing. I can teach her ranch work and how to handle herself in the practical world, but the rest," he gestured helplessly, "the rest I'll need you for." "Then I'll stay as long as you need me, as long as Grace needs me." Clara's expression softened. "James, I know you're worried you'll fail her somehow, that you're too old or too set in your ways or too damaged by Sarah's death. But you're wrong. That child in there sees you clearly, and she still chose you. Trust her judgment. Trust yourself." "I haven't trusted myself in 16 years. But then maybe it's time to start." Clara pushed off from the wall, preparing to head to her own room. "Besides, you're not alone in this anymore. Grace has 2 people looking out for her now. That's more than most children get." She left James standing in the hallway, surrounded by the quiet sounds of a house that was finally, properly, a home. He walked back downstairs, intending to bank the fire and check the doors, but found himself instead at the window, looking out at his land silvered by moonlight. Somewhere out there, beyond the hills and the creek and the fence lines he'd built with his own hands, Marcus Cole's body was being prepared for burial. The man who'd spent 16 years plotting revenge would be put in the ground without ceremony or mourning. His schemes ended by his own arrogance and underestimation. Cole had wanted to destroy James, to take everything he valued and grind it to dust. Instead, his final act had brought Grace into James's life, had given James something he'd thought lost forever: purpose, family, a reason to face each new day with something more than grim determination. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't built on so much death and pain. James thought about the 12 women in Cole's ledger, the 12 families who had received telegrams explaining how their mothers and wives and daughters had really died. He thought about Martha Bennett, who'd tried to give Grace safety and had paid for it with her life. He thought about David and his wife, dead in Oregon, never knowing their daughter would end up sealed in a freight car, left to die in the Montana heat. So much grief. So much loss. And out of it all, one stubborn child who'd refused to die, who'd held on long enough for an aging rancher to hear her cough through the cicada noise and break a railroad seal he had no legal right to break. Chance, fate, divine intervention. James didn't know what to call it, and it didn't matter. What mattered was Grace was alive, she was safe, and she was his to protect now. Officially, legally, permanently his. The weight of that responsibility should have crushed him. Instead, it felt like he'd been carrying something heavy for years without realizing it, and had finally been given permission to set it down and pick up something else. Something lighter. Something that looked like hope. He checked the doors and windows out of long habit, banked the fire to coals that would last through the night, and climbed the stairs to his own room. But he paused at Grace's door, pushing it open just enough to see her sleeping form. She'd kicked off half her blankets, one arm flung over her head in complete abandonment to sleep. Safe. Secure. Finally, after months of fear and abuse and near death, able to rest without terror. James pulled the blankets back up, tucking them around her shoulders. She stirred, mumbling something that might have been his name, then settled again. "Sleep well, daughter," he whispered again, still testing out the word, still marveling that it was his to say. He went to his own room and lay in the darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling, the night birds calling, the wind moving through the cottonwoods. The same sounds he'd heard every night for 16 years. But tonight, they sounded different. Tonight they sounded like the beginning of something instead of the endless middle of nothing. James Callahan, who'd spent half his life hunting dangerous men and the other half hiding from himself, closed his eyes, and let himself imagine a future that included a dark-haired girl learning to ride horses and make dumplings and find her place in a world that had tried so hard to convince her she didn't have one. And for the first time in 16 years, the future didn't look empty. It looked like possibility. Morning came too early, sunlight streaming through James's window with the kind of aggressive brightness that promised another scorching day. He dressed quickly, pulling on work clothes worn soft from years of use, and headed downstairs to find Clara already in the kitchen, coffee brewing and bacon sizzling in the cast-iron pan. "Grace still sleeping?" he asked, pouring himself a cup of the strong black coffee that was the only way he knew how to start a day. "Like the dead," Clara said, then winced at her own word choice. "Poor thing probably hasn't slept properly in months. Let her rest as long as she needs." James nodded, settling at the table with the week's newspaper Tom had brought yesterday. The headline screamed about Marcus Cole's death and the discovery of his crimes, the kind of sensational story that would have the whole territory talking for months. 12 murdered women, systematic fraud, a revenge plot 16 years in the making. It read like a dime novel, except the bodies were real, and the grief would last long after people stopped gossiping. He was halfway through the article when Grace appeared in the doorway, her hair tangled from sleep, wearing one of Clara's nightgowns that hung to her ankles like a dress. "Morning, Papa," she said, the title still sounding new and strange and wonderful in her mouth. James felt something warm settle in his chest. "Morning, daughter. Sleep well? Better than I have in forever." Grace climbed into the chair beside him, eyeing the bacon with obvious hunger. "What's the newspaper say?" "Grown-up things that don't concern you," Clara said firmly, whisking the paper away and replacing it with a plate of eggs and bacon. "Eat your breakfast. We've got a busy day ahead." Grace attacked the food with the enthusiasm of someone still making up for months of deprivation. Between bites, she asked, "What kind of busy?" "The kind where we start teaching you what it means to be a rancher's daughter," James said. "Thought we'd start with the horses. See if we can't find you a mount gentle enough to learn on." Grace's eyes lit up. "Really? Today? No time like the present. Soon as you're done eating and dressed proper, we'll head to the barn." The child finished her breakfast in record time, nearly choking in her haste. Clara sent her upstairs to change into the spare clothes they'd altered to fit her, a simple dress that would work for light ranch duties, sturdy enough to withstand Grace's enthusiastic approach to everything. When Grace thundered back downstairs, James was waiting by the door, hat in hand. Clara called after them. "Be careful with her, James. She's still recovering." "I know what I'm doing," James replied, though the truth was he hadn't taught anyone anything in 16 years and wasn't entirely sure he remembered how. The barn was dim and cool after the bright morning sun, smelling of hay and leather and horse sweat. James kept 6 horses, 4 for ranch work, 1 aging mare who'd been Sarah's favorite, and a young gelding he'd been training for sale. He led Grace down the line of stalls, letting her peek in at each animal. "This here's Thunder," he said, stopping at a large bay stallion. "He's my main working horse. Too much spirit for a beginner, but he's loyal once you've earned his trust." Grace reached out tentatively, letting Thunder sniff her hand. The horse wuffled against her palm, and she giggled, a bright childish sound James realized he hadn't heard from her before. They moved to the next stall. "This is Molly. She was my wife's horse, gentle as they come, patient with riders who don't know what they're doing yet." Molly was a dappled gray mare, 20 years old if she was a day, with kind eyes and a disposition that had made her Sarah's constant companion. James hadn't ridden her since Sarah's death, couldn't bring himself to saddle the animal that reminded him so sharply of loss. But watching Grace stroke Molly's nose, seeing the way the old mare lowered her head to accept the child's attention, James felt something shift. Maybe it was time to let Molly be useful again, time to let her carry someone who needed her. "Want to try sitting on her?" James asked. Grace's eyes went wide. "You mean it? Right now?" "Right now, but we do this properly. First rule of horses. You don't get on until you know how to handle them from the ground." He spent the next hour teaching Grace the basics. How to approach a horse safely, always from the side so you didn't startle them. How to check their hooves for stones and their coats for burrs. How to halter and lead using firm but gentle pressure. Grace absorbed it all with fierce concentration, asking questions that showed she was actually thinking, not just going through motions. Why do we brush them before riding? She asked, wielding the curry comb with more enthusiasm than skill. Shows respect. You're asking the horse to work for you, to carry your weight and respond to your commands. Least you can do is make sure they're comfortable first. James demonstrated the proper circular motion. Also lets you check for injuries or sore spots. A horse can't tell you something hurts. You have to notice. Like how people can't always say when they're hurt either, Grace said quietly. Sometimes you just have to pay attention. The insight was too mature, too hard-won. James paused in his brushing to look at her. That's right, he said. That's exactly right. And Grace? If you're ever hurt, physically or otherwise, you tell me. Don't hide it and hope I notice. Promise me that. I promise, Grace said, meeting his eyes. But you have to promise the same thing. No pretending everything's fine when it's not. The demand surprised a laugh out of him. Deal. We'll both work on the honesty thing. When Molly was properly groomed, James lifted Grace onto the mare's back. The child sat rigid at first, gripping the horse's mane with white-knuckled intensity. Easy, James said, keeping one hand on Molly's bridle and the other on Grace's leg to steady her. She can feel your fear. Relax your shoulders. Breathe deep. Let your weight settle natural into your hips. Grace tried, her small body gradually loosening as Molly stood patient as a statue. James led them in slow circles around the barnyard, keeping up a steady stream of instruction about posture and balance and how to move with the horse instead of against it. By the time Clara called them for lunch, Grace was grinning so wide her face must have hurt, and Molly was walking with more spring in her step than James had seen in years. That was amazing, Grace breathed as James lifted her down. Can we do it again tomorrow? Every day if you want. But first you're going to be sore in muscles you didn't know you had. Clara will give you a salt bath tonight, help with the aching. They walked back to the house together, Grace chattering about everything she'd learned, her enthusiasm infectious. James found himself smiling more than he had in years, caught up in her joy. The afternoon was spent on quieter pursuits. Clara taught Grace how to mend clothes, showing her the proper way to make stitches small and even. James worked on ranch accounts at the kitchen table, half listening to their conversation, comfortable in a way he'd forgotten was possible. It was so peaceful, so normal, that when Tom arrived just before dinner with a grim expression and 2 telegrams in his hand, the interruption felt like a physical blow. James, Tom said, his voice carrying bad news. We need to talk, privately. They stepped onto the porch, leaving Clara and Grace inside. Tom handed over the telegrams without preamble. The first was from the federal marshal's office in Denver. They'd been investigating Marcus Cole's associates, the men who'd purchased land through his fraudulent schemes. Most claimed ignorance, said they'd bought property in good faith. But 3 names stood out, known criminals, men with records of violence and intimidation. And all 3 had purchased land surrounding the Callahan Ranch. The second telegram was worse. It was from a lawyer in Billings, representing something called the Montana Territory Land Development Corporation. They claimed legal ownership of Martha Bennett's homestead based on documents signed before her death, and they were demanding Grace be removed from the property immediately pending a court review of the estate. James read both telegrams twice, his jaw clenching tighter with each pass. This is Cole's doing. Even dead, he's still causing trouble. That's what I figure, Tom agreed. He set up a network, probably knew if something happened to him, these associates would continue the plan. They want your land, James, or they want to make holding on to it so expensive and difficult that you give up. I'm not giving up anything. I know that. But this corporation, they've got lawyers, James, good ones, and they're claiming Martha signed over her property rights before she died. If they can prove that in court, then Grace loses her inheritance and I lose the buffer between my land and whatever they're planning. James crumpled the telegrams in his fist. How long do we have? Judge Harrison scheduled a hearing for 2 weeks from now. You'll need to present evidence that Martha's signature was forged or obtained under duress. Problem is, most of the direct evidence died with Cole. Grace witnessed him forcing her mother to sign papers. That's testimony. Tom's expression was pained. James, she's 7 years old. Any halfway decent lawyer will tear apart a child's testimony, especially when that child stands to inherit significant property. They'll claim she's been coached, that she doesn't understand what she saw, that she's lying. James's voice was flat and dangerous. "They'll put my daughter on the stand and call her a liar. They'll do whatever it takes to win. These aren't honorable men we're dealing with." James looked through the window at Grace, who was carefully threading a needle under Clara's patient instruction. 3 days ago, she'd been dying in a freight car. Now she was learning to sew and ride horses and be a child. And somewhere out there, men who'd conspired with Marcus Cole were plotting to take away the only security she had. "What do you recommend?" James asked quietly. "Get a lawyer of your own, someone who knows land law and isn't afraid of a fight. I can ask around, see who—" "No." James's voice was hard. "I know exactly who we need. Samuel Morrison. Used to practice law in Denver before he moved here to be a country doctor. He gave it up after his wife died, said he was tired of defending guilty men." "Doc Morrison?" Tom's eyebrows rose. "I didn't know he was a lawyer." "Most people don't. He doesn't advertise it. But he's sharp, Tom, sharper than any circuit lawyer we could hire. And he already knows Grace's case. He treated her when I brought her in. He's seen the evidence of abuse firsthand." "You think he'd be willing to come out of retirement?" "Only one way to find out." James headed for the barn. "I'm riding into town. Tell Claire I'll be back by dark." The ride to town gave James too much time to think. Cole's network was still active, still working to complete what their leader had started. The Montana Territory Land Development Corporation was probably just a front, a legitimate-seeming entity hiding the same criminal intent that had motivated Cole. They wanted his land, wanted it enough to kill for it, to frame a dead woman's signature, to threaten a 7-year-old orphan. The question was why? What made the Callahan Ranch worth all this effort and planning? Doc Morrison was in his office, organizing medical supplies, when James walked in. The doctor took one look at James's face and sighed. "Whatever it is, the answer's probably no," Morrison said, but there was no heat in it. James laid out the situation in blunt terms, the telegrams, the corporation's claim, the hearing in 2 weeks. Morrison listened without interrupting, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "So you want me to represent Grace in court," Morrison said when James finished. "Argue against a corporation with professional lawyers and probably unlimited funds, all based on the testimony of a traumatized child and circumstantial evidence about a dead man's crimes." "Yes. That's suicide, legally speaking. We'd be destroyed." "Maybe, but you and I both know Martha Bennett's signature was forged. We know Cole was systematically murdering women and stealing their land. We know Grace is the rightful heir." James leaned forward. "And more than that, Samuel, we know what's right. You gave up law because you were tired of defending guilty men. Here's your chance to defend someone who's actually innocent." Morrison was quiet for a long moment, staring at his medical instruments like they held answers. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "My wife died of pneumonia. Simple illness, could happen to anyone. But the thing that killed her wasn't the pneumonia. It was the fact that we couldn't afford proper care. I was spending all my time defending men who'd stolen and killed and lied, making good money at it, and I couldn't save my own wife because I was too busy getting rich off other people's misery." He looked up, meeting James's eyes. "I swore when she died that I'd never use my law training again, that I'd stick to healing and leave justice to someone else." "And has that worked out for you?" James asked quietly. "Has stepping away from justice made you feel better about your wife's death?" "No," Morrison admitted. "It's made me feel like a coward." "Then here's your chance to stop being one. Grace needs you, Samuel. She needs someone who knows the law and isn't afraid to fight dirty when necessary. Someone who can stand up in that courtroom and make sure she doesn't lose everything because some criminals want to finish what Cole started." Morrison stood, walking to the window, hands clasped behind his back. Outside, the town went about its business, people moving through their lives unaware that a child's future was being decided in a doctor's office. "If I do this," Morrison said slowly, "I do it my way. No holding back, no gentlemanly restraint. I will find every legal tool available and use it. I will make the other side's lawyers wish they'd never taken this case. And James, I'll need your complete honesty. No holding back information because you think it might hurt Grace's case. I need to know everything." "You'll have it. And one more thing." Morrison turned to face him. This isn't just about property or inheritance. This is about establishing that Grace Bennett is your legal daughter with all the rights and protections that entails. We're going to push for the guardianship to be finalized immediately before the property hearing. Make it clear that anyone trying to take her land is trying to take it from a child under the protection of James Callahan. Make them think twice about how hard they want to fight. A slow smile spread across James's face. You devious bastard. I told you I'd fight dirty. Morrison was already pulling law books from a high shelf, dust flying. Get Judge Harrison to move up the guardianship hearing to this week. Tomorrow, if possible. I'll start preparing arguments for both cases. And James? Send Clara to me. If she's Grace's blood relative, I want her testimony documented and sworn before anyone can claim we manufactured it later. James left the doctor's office feeling something he hadn't felt since this whole mess started. Hope. Not the fragile, desperate kind, but solid hope backed by strategy and legal knowledge. He stopped by the sheriff's office to brief Tom, then headed back to the ranch as the sun started its descent toward the mountains. The evening light turned everything gold, painting the landscape with the kind of beauty that made Montana worth fighting for. Grace was waiting on the porch when he rode up, her small face anxious. You were gone a long time, she said as he dismounted. I was worried. Just handling some business in town. James tied his horse and joined her on the porch. Grace, I need to talk to you about something serious. Can you handle serious right now? She straightened her shoulders, trying to look older than 7. I can handle it. There are some men who worked with Marcus Cole. They're trying to take your mother's land, your land, claiming Martha signed papers giving it to them before she died. Grace's face went pale. But she didn't. She would never. I know. But these men have lawyers and documents, and they're going to try to prove their claim in court, which means we need to fight back. I've hired Doc Morrison to represent you. He's a good man and a smart lawyer, and he's going to make sure you keep what's rightfully yours. Will I have to go to court? Will I have to see those men? James wanted to lie, wanted to tell her she could stay safe at the ranch while adults handled everything, but he'd promised honesty. Probably yes. Morrison might need you to testify about what you saw, what Martha said, how Cole treated both of you. It won't be easy, Grace. They'll ask hard questions and try to confuse you. But I'll be there, and Clara will be there, and we won't let them hurt you. Grace was quiet, her small hands twisted in her lap. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady despite the fear James could see in her eyes. If I don't testify, they might take the land. And if they take the land, they can get closer to your ranch. They can hurt you like they hurt Mama. This isn't about protecting me, Grace. You don't have to. Yes, I do. Grace's voice was fierce. You promised I was safe, and you kept that promise. Now it's my turn to help keep us all safe. If I have to stand up in court and tell them what Marcus did, then that's what I'll do. Pride swelled in James's chest, almost painful in its intensity. You're braver than most grown men I've known. I'm scared, Grace admitted. But being scared and being brave aren't opposites, right? That's what Mama used to say. Being brave means doing the right thing even when you're scared. Your mama was a smart woman. James pulled Grace into a hug, feeling her small arms wrap around him. And she'd be proud of you right now. They sat together as the sun set, turning the sky purple and orange and gold. Clara called them in for dinner, and they ate together at the kitchen table. Beef stew and cornbread, simple food that tasted better for being shared. After Grace went to bed, James and Clara sat on the porch in the darkness, listening to the night sounds. Tom told me about the telegrams, Clara said quietly, about the corporation claiming Martha's land. Morrison's handling it. We'll fight them in court, establish Grace's legal right to her inheritance. And if we lose? We won't lose. James's voice carried more confidence than he felt. But even if we did, even if they somehow managed to take the land, Grace would still have a home here. She'd still be my daughter. The land doesn't change that. The land might not, but the men behind that corporation might. Clara's voice was troubled. James, if they're willing to murder 12 women to steal property, what makes you think they'll stop with legal proceedings? What if they decide direct action is more efficient? It was the question James had been avoiding all day. Cole had been willing to kill to get what he wanted. His associates probably had the same moral flexibility. Then I'll deal with them the way I used to deal with threats, James said quietly. Before I retired, I had a reputation. Men knew better than to cross me. Maybe it's time to remind people of that. You're not a bounty hunter anymore. No, but I'm a father now, and that makes me more dangerous than I ever was as a hunter, because I've got something worth protecting. Clara reached out and squeezed his hand. Just don't do anything that'll get you killed. Grace has already lost too many people. I don't plan on dying anytime soon. Got too much to live for now. They sat in comfortable silence until the cold drove them inside. James checked the doors and windows with more care than usual, his old instincts awakening. If Cole's associates decided to escalate beyond legal proceedings, they'd find the Callahan Ranch was a harder target than they expected. The next morning brought Judge Harrison's clerk with news that the guardianship hearing had been moved to the following day. Morrison had argued that establishing Grace's legal status was time-critical given the property dispute, and Harrison had agreed, which meant James had less than 24 hours to prepare Grace for what was coming. He found her in the barn, brushing Molly with careful attention to the horse's coat. She looked up when James entered, her expression immediately wary. "Something's wrong," she said. Not a question. "Not wrong exactly, just moving faster than expected." James settled onto a hay bale, gesturing for Grace to sit beside him. "The hearing where I officially become your guardian, it's tomorrow. Judge Harrison wants to make it legal before the property dispute hearing, so there's no question about who has the right to speak for you." "That's good though, right? That means we'll be official family sooner." "It is good, but Grace, it also means you'll need to talk to the judge. Answer questions about whether you want this, whether you feel safe here, whether you understand what guardianship means." Grace's hand stilled on the brush. "What if I say the wrong thing? What if the judge decides you shouldn't be my guardian?" "There's no wrong thing to say as long as you're honest. Judge Harrison is a fair man. He's not trying to trick you or separate us. He just needs to make sure this is what you really want, that you're not being forced or pressured." "I'm not," Grace said immediately. "This is exactly what I want. You and Clara and this ranch and learning to ride Molly, all of it." "Then that's what you tell the judge." James pulled her into a side hug. "Tomorrow we ride into town, you wear your best dress, and you tell Judge Harrison the truth. That's all you need to do." The rest of the day passed in a blur of preparation. Clara pressed Grace's good dress and braided her hair with ribbons. James cleaned his suit, the same one he'd worn to Sarah's funeral and hadn't touched since. Morrison sent a messenger with documents to review and questions Grace might face. That night, Grace couldn't sleep. James heard her moving around upstairs, restless and anxious. He climbed to her room and found her sitting by the window, looking out at the moonlit ranch. "Can't quiet your mind?" he asked from the doorway. "Keep thinking about tomorrow. What if—" "Grace!" James crossed to her, kneeling so they were eye level. "Remember what your mama said about being brave even when you're scared?" She nodded. "Tomorrow you're going to walk into that courthouse, and you're going to tell the truth about what you want. And no matter what happens, I'll be right there with you. You won't be alone in this. Promise?" "Promise." James stood, offering his hand. "Now come on. You need sleep, and I know a trick that used to help me when I couldn't settle my thoughts." He led her downstairs to the kitchen, where he heated milk with honey and a touch of vanilla. They sat at the table together, sipping the warm drink, talking about nothing important, horses and whether the garden would produce tomatoes this year. By the time Grace's cup was empty, her eyes were drooping. James carried her back to bed, tucking her in like he imagined fathers were supposed to do. "Papa?" she murmured, already half asleep. "Thank you for finding me, for not walking away." "Thank you for holding on long enough to be found," James replied, his voice rough. "Sleep now, daughter. Tomorrow, we make it official." He stayed until her breathing evened into sleep, then returned to his own room. But sleep eluded him, his mind racing through everything that could go wrong tomorrow. Judge Harrison was fair, but he was also a stickler for proper procedure. If there was any question about Grace's competency to express her wishes, any hint that she was being influenced, James forced the thoughts away. Morrison knew what he was doing. Grace knew her own mind, and James had 16 years of isolation to make up for, 16 years of living half a life. Tomorrow they'd stand before a judge and make permanent what already felt inevitable. Tomorrow Grace Bennett would legally become his daughter, and God help anyone who tried to take her away. Morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that made everything feel momentous. James was awake before dawn, unable to stay in bed when nervous energy thrummed through his veins like electricity. He dressed in his suit, fingers fumbling with buttons he hadn't fastened in 16 years, and went downstairs to find Clara already preparing breakfast. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked, pouring him coffee without being asked. "Keep thinking about everything that could go wrong. Then stop thinking and start trusting." Clara cracked eggs into a pan with more force than necessary. "Grace knows what she wants. You know what you want. The judge just needs to hear it said out loud. It's a formality, James. Don't make it bigger than it is." But it felt bigger. It felt like standing on the edge of something that could either be the beginning of everything or the end of the fragile hope he'd allowed himself to build. Grace appeared in the doorway wearing her good dress, her hair already braided and ribboned by Clara's expert hands. She looked young and scared and determined all at once. "I'm ready," she announced, though her voice wavered slightly. They ate breakfast in near silence, the weight of the coming day pressing down on all of them. Even Clara's usual stream of conversation had dried up, leaving only the clink of silverware against plates and the ticking of the kitchen clock. The ride to town took forever and no time at all. Grace sat between James and Clara in the wagon, her small hands twisted in her skirt. James wanted to say something comforting, but the words stuck in his throat. What if the judge asked questions Grace couldn't answer? What if someone challenged his fitness as a guardian? What if— "Papa," Grace said quietly, pulling him from his spiraling thoughts. "You're doing it again. The worrying thing." Despite everything, James smiled. "Can't seem to help it. Mama used to say that worrying is just praying for things to go wrong, so maybe we should pray for them to go right instead." James wasn't a religious man, hadn't been since Sarah died, and prayer had felt like shouting into an empty void. But looking at Grace's earnest face, he found himself hoping to whatever might be listening that this child would get the stability she deserved. The courthouse was a 2-story brick building that dominated the center of town, imposing and official. Morrison was waiting on the steps, dressed in a proper suit that made him look every inch the lawyer he'd once been. "Right on time," Morrison said, shaking James's hand. "Judge Harrison is ready for us. Remember, this is straightforward, just establishing guardianship. The property dispute hearing is next week. Don't let anyone confuse the two issues." "Anyone?" Clara asked sharply. "Who else is going to be there?" Morrison's expression darkened. "The Montana Territory Land Development Corporation sent a representative. Claims they have an interest in Grace's welfare since they're contesting her inheritance. Harrison allowed it over my objection." James felt his jaw clench. "They're trying to intimidate her." "Probably, but we won't let them." Morrison knelt in front of Grace, his voice gentling. "Grace, there might be a man in that courtroom who asks you questions. He might try to confuse you or make you second-guess yourself, but you just tell the truth about what you want and who you feel safe with. Can you do that?" Grace nodded, her small chin lifted in determination that reminded James painfully of her mother's stubbornness. The courtroom was smaller than James expected, with wooden benches and windows that let in bars of morning sunlight. Judge Harrison sat behind an elevated desk, a stern-looking man in his 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Tom Brennan stood near the back, present as a witness. And sitting in the front row, looking entirely too comfortable, was a man in an expensive suit, the corporation's representative. He turned as they entered, his gaze sliding over James with calculated assessment before settling on Grace with an expression that made James want to put himself between them. "Mr. Callahan, Miss Bennett, please approach," Judge Harrison said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "We're here to consider the petition for guardianship of Grace Elizabeth Bennett, minor child, by James Callahan. Mr. Callahan, you understand the responsibilities of guardianship." "Yes, Your Honor." James's voice was steady despite the hammering of his heart. "And you believe yourself capable of providing appropriate care, education, and guidance for this child?" "I do." Harrison turned to Grace, his expression softening slightly. "Miss Bennett, You're 7 years old, is that correct? Yes, sir. Grace's voice was small but clear. Do you understand why you're here today? Yes, sir. Mr. Callahan, James, wants to be my legal guardian, my father. And is that something you want as well? Grace looked up at James, and something in her expression made his chest tight. More than anything, sir. James saved my life. He gave me a home when I had nowhere to go. He promised I was safe, and he kept that promise. I want to stay with him forever. Forever is a long time, Miss Bennett. What if circumstances change? What if Mr. Callahan's situation changes? Before Grace could answer, the corporation's representative stood. Your Honor, if I may, I think it's important to establish whether this child truly understands the implications of this decision, or if she's simply responding to recent trauma with attachment to the first adult who showed her kindness. Morrison was on his feet immediately. Your Honor, I object. This hearing is about guardianship, not psychological analysis. Mr. Thornton's corporation has no standing to question this child's mental capacity. Mr. Thornton's corporation has a significant financial interest in Miss Bennett's estate, Thornton replied smoothly. We simply want to ensure the child's best interests are being served, not Mr. Callahan's financial interests in controlling her property. James felt rage flash through him, hot and dangerous. The implication that he wanted Grace for her land, that he'd manipulated a traumatized child for personal gain. Harrison's gavel cracked down. That's enough. Mr. Thornton, your corporation's property claim will be addressed in next week's hearing. This proceeding is solely about the child's welfare and her wishes regarding guardianship. You may observe but not interfere. Clear? Crystal, Your Honor. Thornton sat back down, but his satisfied smirk made James want to hit something. Harrison turned back to Grace. Miss Bennett, I apologize for that interruption. Now, I need you to answer honestly. Do you feel pressured or obligated to accept Mr. Callahan as your guardian? Has anyone told you that you must agree to this? No, sir. Grace's voice was stronger now, anger bleeding through the nervousness. Nobody has to tell me anything. I know what I want. James didn't ask me to choose him. I chose him. When I was dying in that freight car, when I thought nobody in the whole world cared if I lived or died, James broke the seal and pulled me out. He carried me to his ranch and took care of me. He didn't have to do any of that. He could have left me there or handed me over to someone else, but he didn't. Tears started rolling down her cheeks, but her voice never wavered. And when I found out Marcus was dead, when I realized I was finally safe, James promised me more than safety. He promised me a real home with people who want me, not because they have to, but because they choose to. So yes, Your Honor, I understand what guardianship means. It means James will be my father, and I'll be his daughter, and nobody can take that away from us. The courtroom was dead silent. Harrison pulled off his spectacles and cleaned them, a gesture that James suspected was meant to give the judge time to compose himself. Mr. Callahan, Harrison said finally, you heard the child's testimony. Do you accept the responsibilities of guardianship freely and without reservation? I do, Your Honor. James found his voice was rough. I know I'm not perfect. I'm old and set in my ways, and I don't know the first thing about raising a daughter. But I'll learn. And I'll give Grace everything I have, my home, my name, my protection. She'll never doubt that she's wanted. Never doubt that she belongs. Harrison nodded slowly. Mrs. Mitchell, you're the child's blood relative. Do you support this guardianship? Clara stood, her voice clear and firm. I do, Your Honor. Grace is my niece by blood, but she's chosen James Callahan to be her father. I support that choice completely, and I'll remain at the ranch to help ensure Grace has both male and female guidance as she grows. Very well, Harrison picked up his gavel. Having heard testimony from all relevant parties, and finding that the child's wishes are clear and her welfare will be best served by this arrangement, I hereby grant legal guardianship of Grace Elizabeth Bennett to James Callahan, effective immediately. Mr. Callahan, you are now legally responsible for this child's care, education, and welfare until she reaches majority or circumstances warrant a change. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through James's entire body. Just like that, it was done. Legal. Official. Permanent. Grace threw her arms around James's waist, holding on tight. He wrapped his arms around her, dimly aware that Clara was crying happy tears, and Morrison was gathering papers, and Thornton was watching them all with an expression of cold calculation. But none of that mattered in this moment. Grace was his daughter now, legally, officially, his. They emerged from the courthouse into brilliant sunshine. Grace was still holding James's hand, swinging their joined hands in a way that made her look exactly 7 instead of the old soul she usually seemed. "Can we get ice cream?" she asked. "To celebrate?" "I think that can be arranged," James said, his heart feeling lighter than it had in years. They were halfway to the general store when Thornton stepped out of an alley, blocking their path. 2 large men flanked him, and the casual way they positioned themselves spoke of violence barely leashed. "Mr. Callahan," Thornton said, his smile not reaching his cold eyes. "Congratulations on your new daughter. Such a touching scene in the courtroom." "Get out of my way, Thornton." "In a moment. I just wanted to make something clear before next week's hearing. The Montana Territory Land Development Corporation has legal claim to Martha Bennett's property. We have documents signed by Mrs. Bennett herself transferring ownership upon her death. Your daughter's testimony won't change that." "Forged documents," Morrison said sharply, moving to stand beside James, "obtained through fraud and coercion." "Prove it." Thornton's smile widened. "You'll need more than a child's confused memories to overturn legal contracts. And Mr. Callahan, even if by some miracle you win the property dispute, you should know my employers don't give up easily. They've invested considerable resources in acquiring land in this territory. They won't let one stubborn rancher and an orphan girl stand in their way." James felt Clara pull Grace behind her, shielding the child from Thornton's gaze. His own hand moved toward his belt, where his gun would have been if he'd worn it to court. "Is that a threat?" James asked quietly, his voice carrying the dangerous calm that had made outlaws think twice in his hunting days. "It's a statement of fact." Tom Brennan stepped forward from where he'd been watching, his hand resting on his gun. "Mr. Thornton, I'm hearing what sounds like threats of arson and violence. Want to rethink your words before I arrest you for intimidation?" Thornton's smile never faltered. "No threats, Sheriff. Simply pointing out the dangers inherent in ranch life. Mr. Callahan knows better than anyone how quickly fortunes can change. After all, his wife died so unexpectedly all those years ago." The implication, the suggestion that Sarah's death had been anything but natural, made James see red. He took a step forward, and Thornton's men shifted, reaching for weapons. "James, don't!" Morrison's hand on his arm was firm. "That's what he wants. Give him an excuse to claim self-defense or paint you as violent and unfit." James forced himself to breathe, to step back, to remember that Grace was watching, that his daughter needed him to be smart, not reckless. "You're right," he said to Morrison, loud enough for Thornton to hear. "Some men aren't worth the effort of violence." He looked at Thornton, his voice dropping to a level that only the man in front of him could hear. "But understand this. You come near my ranch, near my daughter, near anything I care about, and legal consequences will be the least of your worries. I spent 30 years tracking men meaner than you. I know 100 ways to make someone disappear in Montana Territory, and most of them don't involve anything that would get me arrested." Thornton's smile finally faltered. "Is that a threat, Mr. Callahan?" "No, it's a promise, and I keep my promises." They walked past Thornton and his men, Grace's hand gripped tight in James's, nobody speaking until they were several blocks away. Only then did Clara let out a shaky breath. "That man is dangerous, James. He wasn't bluffing about his employers." "I know." James's mind was already racing ahead, cataloging threats and planning responses. "Tom, what can you do legally?" "Not much unless they actually do something." Thornton was careful with his words. Implied threats aren't the same as actual threats in the eyes of the law. Tom's expression was troubled. "But I can increase patrols near your ranch, make it clear we're watching. And James, you might want to consider hiring some hands, men who can handle themselves if trouble comes calling." "I'll think about it." James looked down at Grace, who'd been quiet through the whole confrontation. "You okay?" "I don't like that man," Grace said quietly. "He smiles wrong, like Marcus did." The comparison made James's blood run cold. Grace had developed instincts about dangerous men through brutal experience. If she sensed something wrong in Thornton, she was probably right. They got ice cream anyway. Vanilla for Grace, nothing for James, who couldn't imagine eating anything with his stomach churning. Then they headed back to the ranch, the celebratory mood from the courthouse thoroughly destroyed. That night, after Grace was in bed, James, Clara, and Morrison sat at the kitchen table planning strategy. "The property hearing is in 6 days," Morrison said, documents spread before him. "I've been going through Martha's finances, her correspondence, everything I can find. There's evidence of coercion, letters where she mentions feeling pressured by Cole, notes about documents she didn't understand being pushed in front of her. But it's circumstantial." "What about Grace's testimony?" Clara asked. "It'll help, but Thornton was right. A child's memory can be challenged in court. We need something concrete. Physical evidence that the signatures were forged or that Martha was under duress when she signed." James thought about Cole's office, about the ledgers and letters Tom had found. What about Cole's records? He kept documentation of all his crimes. Maybe he kept proof of how he manipulated Martha too. "Already went through everything the sheriff seized," Morrison said. "There's evidence of his other crimes, but nothing specific about Martha's property transfer. Cole was careful there." "Then we need to find what Cole didn't keep in his office." James stood, pacing. "Clara, did Martha ever mention storing important papers anywhere? A bank box, maybe, or with a lawyer?" Clara frowned, thinking. "She mentioned once, this was years ago when her first husband was alive, that she kept important documents in her family Bible. Said it was the one place she knew would always be safe." "Her Bible?" Morrison leaned forward. "Where would it be now?" "Probably still at her homestead. After she died, Cole would have searched the house for anything valuable, but he wouldn't have cared about a Bible." Clara's eyes widened. "James, if Martha hid proof of what Cole was doing in her Bible, then it's still there, and Thornton's corporation doesn't know it exists." James grabbed his coat. "I'm riding out there tonight. It's dark, and if Thornton has men watching, then I'll be careful. But Clara, if there's even a chance Martha left evidence, we need to find it before the hearing." Morrison stood as well. "I'm coming with you. If we find legal documents, I need to be there to verify their authenticity for the court." They rode out under a half moon, taking a route that avoided the main road. Martha's homestead sat dark and abandoned, a sad testament to a life cut short by greed. The door wasn't locked. Cole had never bothered, knowing the property would soon be his. Inside, the house still smelled faintly of the woman who'd lived there. Simple furniture, clean but worn. A child's drawings on the wall. Grace's artwork from before everything went wrong. "Where would she keep a Bible?" Morrison asked, lighting a lamp. James looked around, remembering how Sarah had always kept their family Bible in the parlor, in a place of honor. He moved to the shelf beside the fireplace and found it, a worn leather-bound Bible, pages yellowed with age. He opened it carefully, and documents fell out. Letters, receipts, and, his heart jumped, a signed affidavit. Morrison grabbed it, reading quickly in the lamplight. It's dated 3 weeks before Martha's death. She's stating under oath that Marcus Cole has been pressuring her to sign property transfer documents, that she's being threatened, that she fears for her life and her daughter's safety. She names witnesses, the shopkeeper in town, the doctor who treated her supposed illness, the pastor at the church. "Is it enough?" James asked. "It's more than enough. This is a legal document, properly witnessed and notarized. It completely contradicts any property transfer she supposedly signed later. Combined with Cole's documented crimes and Grace's testimony, Morrison's grin was fierce. Thornton's corporation just lost their case." They rode back to the ranch in the darkness, the affidavit secured in Morrison's satchel. James felt something loosen in his chest, the first real hope since Thornton's threats. The next 5 days passed in a blur of preparation. Morrison interviewed the witnesses Martha had named, building an airtight case. Tom increased his patrols, and James noticed several of his neighboring ranchers, men who'd known him for decades, started riding by more often, making their presence known. Grace helped Clara with household tasks and continued her writing lessons with Molly, finding comfort in routine. She asked questions about the upcoming hearing, but didn't seem as frightened as before. She'd already faced the guardianship proceeding and come through it. This was just one more obstacle to overcome. The morning of the property hearing dawned clear and cold, the first hint of autumn in the air. James dressed in his suit again, watching Grace button up her good dress with hands that barely trembled. "Ready?" he asked. "Ready," she confirmed. "Papa, whatever happens today, we're still family, right? The land doesn't change that?" "Nothing changes that," James said firmly. "You're my daughter, and I'm your father. That's permanent, no matter what any court says about property." The courtroom was packed this time. Word had spread about the case, the murdered women, Cole's conspiracy, the orphan fighting for her inheritance. 12 families who'd lost women to Cole's schemes sat in the gallery, silent witnesses demanding justice. Thornton sat at his table with 2 lawyers looking confident. But when Morrison walked in carrying Martha's Bible and the affidavit, something flickered in Thornton's expression. Judge Harrison called the court to order. "We're here to determine the rightful ownership of the property known as the Bennett homestead, currently contested between Grace Bennett, represented by her guardian James Callahan, and the Montana Territory Land Development Corporation. Mr. Morrison, you may present your case." Morrison stood, and James had never seen him look more like the lawyer he'd once been, sharp, focused, dangerous. "Your Honor, the corporation's claim rests on documents allegedly signed by Martha Bennett transferring property ownership upon her death. I will demonstrate that these documents are fraudulent, obtained through coercion, and directly contradicted by Mrs. Bennett's sworn testimony." He held up the affidavit. 3 weeks before her death, her murder, Martha Bennett signed this legal document stating that Marcus Cole was threatening her and her daughter, pressuring her to sign away her property rights, and that any such documents were signed under extreme duress. Thornton's lead lawyer jumped up. "Objection! This document was never disclosed in discovery, and we have no way to verify. It's properly notarized by John Fletcher, Notary Public, and witnessed by William Chen of Chen's General Store and Reverend Thomas Walsh of the Methodist Church. All 3 men are present in this courtroom and willing to testify to its authenticity." Morrison's voice was sharp. "Furthermore, I have testimony from Doc Morrison, myself, regarding arsenic poisoning symptoms observed in Mrs. Bennett before her death, symptoms consistent with gradual poisoning rather than the heart failure that was listed as cause of death." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Harrison's gavel cracked down repeatedly before order was restored. For the next 3 hours, Morrison methodically destroyed the corporation's case. He presented Martha's affidavit, called the witnesses who'd signed it, brought in the shopkeeper who testified about Cole threatening Martha. He showed how the property transfer documents were signed after the affidavit, proving they were obtained through the very coercion Martha had warned about. Then he called Grace to the stand. James watched his daughter walk to the witness chair, her small figure dwarfed by the formal setting. She placed her hand on the Bible, her mother's Bible, and swore to tell the truth. "Grace," Morrison said gently, "did you ever see Marcus Cole force your mother to sign documents?" "Yes, sir, many times. He'd put papers in front of her and tell her to sign, or he'd hurt me. Mama would cry and sign whatever he wanted." "And did your mother ever discuss these documents with you?" "She told me once that Marcus was trying to take our land, but she wouldn't let him. She said she'd found a way to protect us, to make sure people would know the truth if anything happened to her." Grace's voice was clear and steady. "I think she meant the paper Mr. Morrison found, the one in her Bible." Thornton's lawyer tried to shake Grace's testimony, asking leading questions and suggesting her memory was faulty. But Grace held firm, answering each question with simple truth that was impossible to discredit. When it was over, Morrison rested his case. Thornton's lawyers presented their documents and argued technical points, but the damage was done. Martha's affidavit and Grace's testimony had exposed the fraud at the heart of their claim. Harrison retired to his chambers to deliberate. The wait felt endless, Grace sitting between James and Clara, all 3 of them holding hands. Finally, Harrison returned. "Having reviewed all evidence and testimony, I find that the Montana Territory Land Development Corporation's claim to the Bennett property is without merit. The property transfer documents were obtained through fraud, coercion, and intimidation. Martha Bennett's sworn affidavit clearly establishes her intent to retain ownership, and the circumstances of her death, which I am referring to the federal marshal for investigation as potential murder, cast serious doubt on any document signed under duress." He looked directly at Grace. "Miss Bennett, I hereby affirm your right to the property known as the Bennett Homestead, all structures and acreage thereon, to be held in trust and managed by your guardian, James Callahan, until you reach majority. The Montana Territory Land Development Corporation's claim is dismissed with prejudice. The gavel came down, and the courtroom exploded in applause. The families who'd lost women to Cole's conspiracy were crying, hugging each other, finally seeing some measure of justice. Grace turned to James, her eyes shining. "We won?" "We won," James confirmed, pulling her into a hug. "Your mother's land is yours, Grace, and nobody can take it away." Thornton stormed out of the courtroom, his lawyers scrambling to follow. As he passed James, he leaned in close enough to whisper, "This isn't over." "Yes," James said calmly, "it is. And if you or your employers come near my family again, you'll discover exactly how over it is." Tom stepped between them. "Mr. Thornton, I'd suggest you leave town. The federal marshal will want to speak with you and your associates about your connection to Marcus Cole's crimes. Make sure you're available." They emerged from the courthouse to find half the town waiting. People who'd known Martha, who'd suspected Cole but hadn't been able to prove anything, who'd watched 12 women die and known something was wrong. They clapped and called out congratulations, and Grace held tight to James's hand, overwhelmed by the support. Doc Morrison, who'd transformed back into just Morrison now that the case was won, shook James's hand. "That affidavit saved us. Martha knew what Cole was planning. She documented it all, hoping someone would find it and protect Grace." "She protected her daughter from beyond the grave," Clara said quietly. "Made sure Grace would have what was rightfully hers." They celebrated that night at the ranch with a simple dinner, the three of them around the kitchen table. Grace was exhausted but happy, talking about what she wanted to do with her mother's land. "Could we plant an orchard?" she asked. "Mama always wanted apple trees, but she never had time to put them in." "We can plant whatever you want," James said. "It's your land, Grace, your inheritance." "But you'll help me take care of it until I'm old enough to manage it myself?" "Every step of the way." Later, after Grace was asleep, James stood on the porch looking out at his land, and now Grace's land beyond it. 2 ranches side by side, a child's future secured through her mother's foresight and courage. Clara joined him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the evening chill. "You did good today, James. Sarah would be proud." I kept thinking about her during the hearing, about how she always wanted children, how happy she would have been to have a daughter running through this house. James's voice was rough. "Took me 16 years in a sealed freight car, but I finally gave her that. Or Grace gave it to me. I'm not sure which." "Both," Clara said. "You gave each other exactly what you needed." The weeks that followed settled into comfortable rhythm. Grace started school in town, riding Molly there and back each day with growing confidence. She made friends quickly, the other children fascinated by the girl who'd survived a freight car and won her inheritance in court. The Montana Territory Land Development Corporation quietly dissolved, its principals disappearing before the federal marshal could bring charges. Thornton was never seen again. The stolen land was gradually returned to rightful heirs or sold at auction, the money going to the families of Cole's victims. James and Grace worked the 2 ranches together, James teaching her everything he knew about cattle and horses and the land. Clara stayed on, becoming as much a permanent fixture as the house itself, providing the maternal guidance Grace needed. One evening, 6 months after the guardianship hearing, James and Grace stood at the boundary between their properties, looking at newly planted apple saplings that wouldn't bear fruit for years. "Mama would have loved this," Grace said quietly, "seeing her land cared for, knowing I was safe and happy." "I think she knows," James said. "And Grace?" "I think she'd be proud of you, of how brave you were, how you fought for what was right. I was scared the whole time. Being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means doing what's right even when you're terrified. You did that. You stood up in court and told the truth when it would have been easier to stay silent." Grace was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Papa, do you think Mama planned it, finding her way to your ranch, somehow knowing you'd save me?" James thought about the freight car left at that specific depot, the timing that had put him there at exactly the right moment, the note pinned to Grace's dress that had led him to investigate Cole's crimes. Coincidence or design, he'd never know for certain. Maybe, he said. Or maybe your mama just had faith that someone would do the right thing, that the world had at least one person left who'd see a child in trouble and not walk away. I'm glad it was you, Grace said simply. I'm glad you're my papa. I'm glad you're my daughter, James replied, his voice thick. Best thing that ever happened to me, Grace, was hearing your cough through that freight car wall. Changed my whole life. They walked back to the ranch house together as the sun set, painting the Montana sky in shades of gold and purple. Through the windows, they could see Clara setting the table for dinner, lamplight making the kitchen warm and welcoming. James thought about the man he'd been 6 months ago, bitter, isolated, convinced his life was over. And he thought about the man he was now, a father, a guardian, someone with purpose and family and a future worth building, all because a 7-year-old girl had asked him to promise, and he'd said yes. Years passed. Grace grew strong and capable, learning to manage both ranches with skill that made Martha's sacrifice worthwhile. She attended school, then teacher's college, then came home to the land she loved, bringing with her a young man who looked at her the way James had once looked at Sarah. The day Grace married, standing in a dress Clara had sewn from fabric the three of them had chosen together, James walked her down the aisle thinking about promises kept and lives redeemed, about freight cars and cicadas and the specific heat of a Montana summer that had almost killed a child but had instead brought her home. Grace and her husband built their house on her mother's land, the orchard grown tall and bearing fruit. They had children who learned to ride horses and help with cattle, who called James Grandpa, and filled the ranch with the kind of noise and chaos he'd once thought lost forever. Clara lived to see those grandchildren grown, passing peacefully in her sleep at 78, surrounded by the families she'd helped build from broken pieces. And James, who lived to be 86 years old, spent his final years sitting on the porch, watching generations work the land he and Grace had preserved. He died on a summer evening with cicadas singing their eternal song, Grace holding his hand the way she'd held it that first night when she'd asked him to promise. His last words were simple. I kept my promise. And Grace, tears streaming down her weathered face, whispered back, You did, Papa. You kept every single one. They buried him beside Sarah, under a cottonwood tree that had witnessed 16 years of isolation and 30 years of redemption. The headstone was simple, James Callahan, beloved father. And beneath his name, they carved one more line at Grace's insistence. He heard the cough. Because that's what it came down to, in the end. One man hearing one sound on one sweltering afternoon and choosing to investigate instead of walking away. One promise made to a dying child in a freight car. One decision to open his heart after 16 years of keeping it locked. And from that single moment, a whole life had bloomed. Not the life James had lost, but a new life built on different foundations. Not replacement, but renewal. Not forgetting, but moving forward while carrying the past with honor. Grace Bennett Callahan raised her own children on that Montana ranch, teaching them the same lessons James had taught her, about keeping promises, about hearing the people the world tried to silence, about choosing love even when fear seemed safer. And every summer, when the heat pressed down and the cicadas screamed their relentless song, Grace would stand at the old depot where the freight car had sat all those years ago, and she'd remember. Remember dying of thirst and believing no one cared. Remember a rough hand breaking a seal and a gruff voice saying, You're safe now. Remember asking for a promise and having it kept, even when keeping it cost everything. The ranch flourished for generations, a testament to what happens when someone chooses to care when they don't have to. When someone hears a cough through freight car walls and decides that sound, that life, matters enough to break the rules and risk everything. Because in the end, that's what love is. Not the easy affection that costs nothing, but the deliberate choice to protect, to preserve, to promise safety, and then deliver it, no matter the cost. James Callahan had learned that lesson twice in his life. First with Sarah, then with Grace. And the second time, he'd gotten it right. He'd opened his heart when every instinct screamed to keep it closed. He'd chosen family when solitude seemed safer. He'd made a promise to a child nobody wanted and kept it until his last breath. And that promise, that single word spoken in a moment of desperate hope, had changed everything. Not just for Grace, who grew from unwanted orphan to beloved daughter to matriarch of a family that would span generations, but for James, who discovered that the second half of life could be richer than the first if you had the courage to let it. The Callahan Ranch still stands in that Montana valley, worked now by Grace's great-grandchildren, who grow apples in Martha's orchard and tell stories about the summer a freight car brought them an ancestor, about how their great-great-grandfather heard a sound he could have ignored, made a promise he didn't have to keep, and built a legacy from one moment of choosing to care. And on hot summer days, when the cicadas scream and the dust hangs heavy in the air, they remember. Remember that sometimes the most important thing you can do is hear the sound nobody else notices. See the person everybody else ignores. Make a promise when promises are hard. And keep it, no matter what, until the very end. Because that's what love does. That's what family means. That's what it looks like when broken things refuse to stay broken, when abandoned people find their way home, when promises become more important than safety. Grace Bennett had asked James Callahan to promise, and he'd said yes. And in that yes, in that single syllable spoken in a freight car while a child died of thirst, an entire world had been born. A world where unwanted children became wanted, where grieving men found purpose, where sisters became mothers and strangers became family, and empty houses filled with love and laughter, and the beautiful chaos of life lived fully. That was James Callahan's legacy. Not the outlaws he'd caught or the land he'd preserved, but the promise he'd kept to a 7-year-old girl who'd needed someone to choose her. And she'd chosen him right back. And together, they'd built something that would outlast them both, a family forged not from blood alone, but from the deliberate decision to love when love was hard, to stay when leaving would be easier, to promise safety, and then defend it with everything you had. That was the story of Grace Bennett and James Callahan. A story that started with a cough and a promise and ended decades later with generations of children who would never know what it felt like to be unwanted. Because someone, once, had heard a sound through freight car walls and had chosen to care.